Hi. Yeah. Well, that was like my whistle pig wad blowing there. Yeah. So this is my intro song, and I don't know. I don't know where.
It's a dance for radio. Those
It
those
is.
those
I
jazz hands. Yeah.
absolutely spirit fingers, not jazz hands. Oh, so yeah, we have a lot in store of another mysterious episode up ahead. So thank you for joining us. So hello, listener and listeners hostage held. Um,
Hi, folks. Thanks for being here with us.
Welcome to another episode of Radio Free Golgotha. We are past the Golgothite divide. This is episode 34 in honor
Hmm.
of Saint George and wonderful saint he is when doing a podcast with a Brit. So, not to
Oh
annoy
yeah, yeah.
your,
I got plenty to say.
I am. It was a little provocatory. Wow. Just introduce all these different syllabic resonances. It was a little bit provocative, but I also think there's a lot of really lovely meat to go in and explore some topics. And as always, we're going to Sesame Street our way, not TMing in any way, but as an explanation of how we jump from topic to topic. These are a little bit more designed, perhaps, than sometimes we otherwise do. But why the monkey not?
Indeed.
Indeed. So our way of looking at things, I suppose you could say, is welcome, happy feast of Saint George, the famous, the Dragonite, the Drew's saint, the Crusader, the patron, all these different things that we're going to go into.
Mhm.
Our demon for the day is Damostan, if he can be called such, because who is Damostan? But very especially as his correspondence to the Eshu known as Exu Ganga. And so to talk a little bit about the concepts of Ganga and Exu Ganga and all these different forces within Kimbanda. Then as far as a herb, we're looking at crocus. And as a stone, we're looking at jasper in its many facets. As far as a figure and of tarot, we are looking through a lovely Caput Draconis lens and the Fool as a tarot focus. And as far as a style of magic, we talked about patronage, right?
Yeah.
That's what I prepared for. Uh,
Me too. It's
and,
lovely when a plan comes together.
yeah. And then as a dead magician, Franz Bardon, probably a really lovely figure to dive into in depth. So I hope we do it. So on that note, welcome everyone, and let's dive in.
Yeah.
So
Happy Feast of St. George, everyone. It is indeed the St. George of Lydda, which is now spelled Lod. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, in Israel, who's said to die on the 23rd of April in the year 303. And we're going to be getting into, yeah, exactly his associations with soldiering, with killing dragons or subduing dragons and then executing them. Some interesting stuff around like how much he actually fights the dragon and how much he doesn't have to because of his great faith. Talking about some associations with various national identities, not just England, but Bosnia and Herzegovina, Georgia, Ukraine, Malta, Ethiopia, as well as Catalonia and Aragon in Spain and Moscow even, as well as I discovered in May 2019, he was made the official patron saint of the state of Rio de Janeiro next to San Sebastian. And yeah, gonna get into some of that if we want to jump straight in. I guess the first thing to say is that yes, he's a soldier from early on, but he is another one of these saints that begins to accrue various other meanings. The dragon slaying doesn't seem to come in until like the 12th, 13th century.
yeah.
Prior to that, he's definitely said to be a member of the Praetorian Guard for the Roman Emperor Diocletian. This is, and again, he's another one of these examples of Diocletian didn't sleep, didn't eat, did nothing but kill like Christian martyrs, right?
Yes.
And it's not always Diocletian in the actual like history of his hagiography, but it comes to be associated with Diocletian who kills him, who tortures and beheads him in 303. I was reading that in some Islamic traditions, St. George or Georgius is sometimes said to have been killed 3 times and resurrected each time only to be martyred again.
Yes.
Until they finally like do him in. And I have some things when we get to near the end, when we get into some specific English expressions of St. George in the wider folklore that also end up echoing this notion of him being resurrected. But he's one of the 14 holy helpers who become popular in the 14th century as well. I got very interested in those as they turn up in the Schwarze Rabe, the Black Raven of the Faustian traditions that calls upon the 14 holy helpers specifically to help not so much exorcise ghosts or haunting spirits, Stammgeist, but to kind of help them move along their way in, I guess it's ghost laying in terms of not being high ceremonial, but it's even more kind of like friendly. There's a lot of language in Raven about, although you are an obstinate spirit, assume the true form that you were in life as a human, not just come as a human, but come in your actual human form and help me help you to like move on kind of thing, psychopompery kind of stuff, if you want to put it like that. So anyway, he's big with the 14 holy helpers that themselves emerge in the, I think, 14th century, mostly around Germany, and include, you know, many of the greats, the big names. And he's also, even at that point, a prominent military saint, especially since the Crusades. We can jump straight to that, or we can talk about the dragon incident.
I think a couple things, even what you've spoken about, like the 14 holy helpers are really, although they are, you know, second millennia already, it is also, by the time this is coming around, we're talking about the trading of saint patronages to be a more universal practice within Christendom, whereas local saints would become cure-alls for everything in that parish. Yeah. It starts to be, as people move between towns, as these things happen, that because of the plague, specifically with the 14 holy helpers, that this arsenal of saints starts being invoked as against like all the different maladies. And St. George's is heavily invoked for the protection of domestic animals, not just for human health, but as far as keeping animals safe, which there is something to that with the dragon slaying and the things that go on. And yes, dragon slaying was already known for some parts by the time the 14 holy helpers come into play, but this idea that there's this other Diocletian era saint, so he's a contemporary of Cyprian and Justina, according to the larger mythic construct. But these early saints that he gets called a megalomartyr, one of the great martyrs, and just that sounds far more punishing than the actual term's meaning. But megalomartyr or hieromartyr of like one of the first martyrs. And the megalomartyrs are those that are, it's a title reserved for those people who the torture of was exceptional, that like someone who dies multiple times or has to be killed multiple times, or that he is not succumbing to death. So as you said, the soldier fairly early on. Also, I like his point of origin as far as like saying that he is indeed Cappadocian Greek, which means Anatolian. But as we start to uncover more and more about Cappadocia, which has its lore of underground cities, we're finding out more and more how many underground cities there are in Cappadocia. And so this idea of, it kind of plays into a little bit to like the shadow and flame and what have we disturbed in the depths of Moria. Of like, I like the idea that a dragon saint is tied to an area where people lived, you know, hundreds of people under the ground. And that's a very specific origin story that is given there. But as far as things go, yeah, you wanna dive into Dragon?
Sure, yeah. If we like skip ahead just a little bit to the rise of the Golden Legend and its popularity through later medieval Europe. By that point, yeah, he is referred to in the life of St. George in the Golden Legend he's said to be a knight, and he's born in Cappadocia, and he comes to the province of Libya, to a city that's said to be called Selene, and it's here at this city that's said to be a stagnant or a pond like a sea, wherein a dragon was envenoming the whole of the country. And this theme is not just that the dragon is like taking off sheep or cattle, but it is poisoning the land and the people. There's a lot more of like a contagious sense to it, and start to get some ideas around like, this is not just a David and Goliath situation. This is very much a thing that is part of George's conversion efforts. This is the conversion of the town. So there's the whole thing about the presence of the dragon is like poisoning the people in general. And so they start propitiating it by bringing it sheep. So it's not that it's carrying them off. It's that the people are trying to feed this thing in or near the sea. And the idea is that when they don't have enough sheep, they start doing by lot and start, as you know, wicked pagans start feeding their own children and things like that to it to keep them safe. And so George comes along and is wandering about and encounters a woman or a princess, sometimes it's said, of the highborn, of the equivalent of like the mayor of the town, who's had to give his own daughter. And the dragon appears and comes running at them. And St. George, who is on his horse, is said to draw his sword and garnished him with the sign of the cross, and rode hardily against the dragon which came towards him, and smote him with his spear and hurt him sore and threw him to the ground. And after this said to the maid, deliver to me your girdle and bind it about the neck of the dragon and be not afeared. So we have this sense of, there are parallels here with Margaret, for instance, or other dragon saintesses, but that the dragon is subdued, is categorically not killed at this point, and is furthermore bound in a kind of like strength card way and said to be made meek and debonair by this combination of the sign of the cross and this, pure maiden's girdle. And this will become important when we get to the order of the girdle stuff that he's also heavily associated with in Britain. So George drags the dragon, not really drags, but like leads the dragon, this monster made meek through the town, and everyone is freaking out. And he says, no, don't doubt anything, believe in God and Jesus Christ. And if you're all baptized, then I'll slay the dragon. And so the king baptizes all of the people. And then St. George slays the dragon and smote off his head and commanded that he should be thrown in the fields. And they took 4 carts with oxen that drew him out of the city. So it's a big thing, right? He's put a collar on Godzilla and brought him around and then killed him after everyone's agreed to be baptized and converted. And it's said that there are, 15,000 men baptized, and the king did make a church there of Our Lady and St. George, in the which was a fountain of living water, which healeth sick people that drink thereof. So again, there's some watery mysteries going on here. And after this, the king offered St. George as much money as might be numbered, but like a good hero, he refuses it all and commands that instead it should be given to the poor for God's sake, and enjoins the king that he should have the charge of the churches, that he should honor the priests and hear their service diligently, and that he should have pity on the poor people. So again, one of the core things in rereading this for me is that it is not just George was, wandering around and came across some wild animal and subdued it. It's that he's categorically doing this as part of an endeavor to, to spread the word of Christendom and to get these people on side. And I found that quite interesting in terms of the way that the Golden Legend, at least, and how popular that becomes as one of the things that's read in the Vulgate across Europe. And there are various ways that gets incorporated into pre-existing hero slays a dragon without getting too monomythic about it. But I found that an interesting place to kind of consider that. Yeah. Any thoughts on that, Jesse?
Cursory, like any dragon mythic structure within Christendom is fascinating because you're going to get the interpretations as I think we've talked about before of, is it merely a reaction against previous religious expression? Oftentimes it's quoted as a, matriarchal kind of burning times, conquering of a people, but also when you get into Libya, and there's actually been some amazing doctorate and theses written around this type of thing, most of the accounts of dragon lore in the first millennia, and in the second millennia, they get a little bit more mythic, right? There's a lot more descriptions of things that aren't necessarily just everyday fact, where it seems like it's a more supernatural beast, it being recounted by the second millennia Common Era. But in the first one, like in this case, it's near water, and it's near the Mediterranean. And the accounts of Nile crocodiles finding their way as far away as southern Spain, France, Tunisia, Italy, the Balkans, in that, not that there's always a quote-unquote scientific explanation for all these things, but it is interesting to consider that a lot of this might be dealing with the fact that there's a freaking 20-foot crocodilian that is sitting by the shore eating sheep where they would normally just kind of wait. So this notion of a dragon might actually be, a cigar, as it were, Mr. Freud. And it's hard because this St. George specifically has a lot of symbolism added to him, a lot of allegories, symbolism, whatever we want to call it, through the patronage that is given him of certain cities, countries, and events. So the time of year that it is, with it being April and coming out of spring, we should see evidence of May coming by this time within our kind of temperate Western European climates, right? We want to be able to see things are happening. It's dragon synonymous with bad weather, the last of our flocks being sacrificed unnecessarily to him in this way. That there's that even the events of the story get put into local folklore around the feast day, not the time that they were said to have happened. And I love this mythic structure, right? It's what were you saying the other day, that folklore is as much, the original story, but also the things that are said about that and how it modifies, and the value centers that are reified through people telling it the way that they want to tell it. And I think there's something really beautiful in all of that too. St. George, you go through the, I'm sure, present company included, of, permutations, because he's such a quintessential patron saint. Like
Mm.
it's so hard. Like this is early
He's a
on.
patron of patronage almost, right? Like
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
yeah, yeah.
And which is interesting for today. Like I do love that the little snippet right about his lance has a name, right? Which is Ascalon,
Hmm.
which is there's also Ashkelon, which is a city south of Tel Aviv. But Ascalon was used by Winston Churchill for his personal aircraft during World War II.
Hmm.
Of course, this is of course Churchill said that.
Hmm.
That
Hmm.
his personal aircraft is the Lance of St. George. I
No big deal.
yeah, the notion there of, as you said, the various ties into Muslim folklore, because I mean, this is you're dealing with a Holy Land saint, and that's a whole other caboodle, right? It's interesting. We're talking about a saint that died before 300, if it's a historical figure, and George is felt to be historical from the onset. There's
Hmm.
no mystery in the sense of, no, he's a real person. We may disagree about where he's from, but there were other saints that were more mythic from the beginning. He
Yeah.
has always been viewed to be a historical person who we have conflicting facts about because of his deeds, because of his megalomartyr status, that this is a man blessed by God
Mm.
to fight evil, to fight things that are, as I love this idea of poisoning a whole landscape.
Mm.
Not having poisoned and killed, but like withering, that concept of just the strength of a land being gone,
Yeah.
another curse in that way. And the dragon is the focal point of that. I remember a children's book, it was like 5 or 6, but like just this description of George killing the dragon, where it's like it's always set in like a much more European forest mindset of how these things go, but
Mm.
it was still such a gloriously color saturated book, very much referencing the Golden Legend and things. The parallels of Ibn al-Athir of comparing George's death to the crucifixion, like come on, this is a saint. This
Hmm.
like you can't get around it, and that the darkness falls on the earth during George's death. So this is like it's lifted after the resurrection. As you referenced, there's so many miracles ascribed to this saint,
Mm.
and I find all that wonderfully fascinating in the like syncretic overview of who this saint becomes in many permutations. It's always obviously warrior when we're going to go there, but within Brazilian structure and specifically with Umbanda and larger expressions of, especially Rio de Janeiro expressions of candomblé, because the syncretisms are really kind of regional.
Hmm.
But this is Saint George becomes so inextricably linked to Ogun
Mm.
and the West African collection of deity, because there's every culture has Ogun in some way. So this deity of metal that is just intrinsic to West African consciousness, the deity of violence, Orisha, Fodun, whatever we're going to have in these permutations, with varying degrees of consciousness as a specific entity and personality, as well as just the protective force that is metal, that is surgery, that is warfare, all being tied into this idea, or under the ray, as the Umbandistas would call it, of Saint George, Saint Georgi. So you also have the plant, the
Right.
Pala de San Jorge, which is it's a mother-in-law tongue. It's a snake plant. It's the all green one. Some people will also say it's the one that has the yellow on the edge, but this is given to Oshossi. So you have different things there of who's the other co-patron, right, of Rio de Janeiro, of San Sebastian. So referencing our own previous saints there. But the inextricability between that Oshossi-like figure and even Osain a little bit, but the notion of the warrior, the quintessential warrior and defender, that if we can tap into this defense energy, the Saint George becomes the ally that you never knew you needed.
Mm.
That lance of Saint George becomes as important as the horse, as important as the dragon, and becomes, I would argue, in a lot of Brazilian lore, becomes more prominent than Michael, and has a lot of the same kind of patronages and stirrings, but is so revered because he lived. This is something you can ascribe to. And so there's
Right.
this notion too of when you're conflating the Orisha or conflating Nkisi or Fodum to saints, like there's still this notion that these were living people, that these people were not just, mythic in that way. They achieved mythic status does not mean they're a myth. And again, it plays into the St. George is real. St. George is
Yeah.
a real person. And in his lifetime, he may have been a child of the Orisha Ogun, as is the terminology that's used, because
Mm.
his life evidences this,
Mm.
creating order in this way. Yeah, there's a lot there going on.
Yeah, even in like, wandering around the 12 Romanish churches of Coram, right, which includes Saint Vercorge, the iconography, like it's very difficult to tell if a statue is Saint Michael or Saint George sometimes because they're both doing that spear of a dragon. It's a very, very, very similar stance. So there's clearly crossover and cross-pollination and hagiographic blur in iconography as well, even by that time. Yeah. Yeah. I've been tracing specifically the kind of English components of St. George because it's a big deal even in like contemporary English identity, if I can speak for everyone. And not in a big continual contestation that really seems to be pretty old, to go back at least to like the Reformation in various forms. And so I was trying to trace what's going on with that. And I'd love to get into that if you're up for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Please.
Yeah. So in terms of like first miracles that are important to the English, it seems that like he is introduced by returning crusaders, which is obviously occurring across the 11th century and onwards, and earlier incursions before that as well. But there's a miraculous intervention by George that the crusading English speak of in Antioch in 1098, where the saint is said to appear in this blaze of light upon the walls of Jerusalem during the assault on that city. And there are various other appearances. They're usually when the Crusaders are being beaten and they rally as he turns up in this blaze of light, and his name becomes a battle cry to the Crusaders. And so he's brought back and it instantly starts to replace more homegrown English saints like St. Edmund, who had a patronage of the burgeoning idea of a united England, if not Britain, as well as like St. Alban and St. Cuthbert. And so his feast day is recognized by the Synod of Oxford in 1222. And then by the mid 14th century, he's basically said to have ousted Edward the Confessor as the like de facto patron saint of England. And it's often linked by historians to this reemergence of the interest in chivalry and this popularity of it. And this is when the Order of the Garter is founded as well, which, amongst other things, and I don't really want to get too far into it, Elias Ashmole gets really into it and famously trades one of his books of magic for a book on the history of the Order of the Garter, which many historians point out is like, oh, look how important it is. It's even more important than his alchemical experiments. But the Order of the Garter is founded around then. They wear fancy plumed hats and collars and these long blue mantles in procession to and from the eventual St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle, if you're interested in that. So there's already this tie to royal authority to an extent, and the color blue, interestingly. And yeah, you get a lot more of that when we hit like the folk customs and stuff. One of the other ways that he becomes instantly popular, having been brought back by these, by these soldiers killing Saracens, is his spread with the guilds and fraternities and these confraternities, especially strongly in Leicester, in Norwich, in Coventry, in York, in Stratford and Chester, and interestingly enough, not so much in London, which always had a very different idea. Like you see it today with the City of London and the guilds being different from London, being different to the London metropolitan area. But mostly what these confraternities are doing are providing and maintaining effigies in churches. They're also apparently doing a lot of, and this again seems to be something about like, partly inspired by like combat veterans and partly a wider sense of protection of the land. They're doing masses for the dead as well. They are the ones responsible for lighting candles and keeping the candles lit there. The other thing they do, as confraternities do, is parade the statue around villages, and they do it as near to the 23rd of April as possible. And I have some ideas about like why it's near. I mean, in general, we've talked about this a lot, that like the liturgical calendar is not a quantitative time of like, okay, 1201 rolls around on the 23rd of April and now it's George time and no other time, right? That it's done, as we've said before, often done when there's good weather. And there's other examples in later folk custom that it's particularly important to do it when the sun's shining. Because one of the main things they're doing is parading all this stuff around. They're big affairs. They're said to be some of the most extravagant of the liturgical calendar at that time. But there's also things around like the herbs that you gather, which I'll get to in a second. By like the 17th century, he's so linked to like knighthood and chivalry and this reemergence of an interest in heraldry, which even by the 17th century is a lot more like emblematic. It's a lot more being used by like alchemists, as I've been arguing for a while. And it's a lot more of a like revival of dirty medievalism than it is a continuance of it. But even by, where is it? He's, what's the heralds? Fuller, Thomas Fuller. So in 1647, he actually points out that the plain or St. George's cross is the mother of all crosses and doesn't just refer to the red on white that we're probably most familiar with from like football stuff, but it's any plain Greek cross touching the edges of the field of the thing it's written on, not necessarily red or white. So the idea of a St. George's cross is that shape of cross, right? It's taken on that much significance by that point. So I started going through some of the accounts of these parades, some of which we still have. And I really like this section in the English Year by Steve Rood, where he says, what's funny is even more popular to the crowd than the saint himself was the figure of the dragon. Surprise, surprise, everyone loves a dragon. This could be a small one made of wood and mounted on a pole with snapping jaws worked by a string, or could be a more elaborate basket work that men could carry from inside or wheel along. And some of the oldest records we have of these kinds of parades are the bookkeeping, are the economics of it all, are church records listing how much it costs to put the thing on. And they feature, this much cloth we need, these many ribbons and things, but there's usually a reference to the material they need to make the dragon. It's considered like really, really crucial. In Norwich to this day, I think, technically St. George's Day is also Mayor's Day, when the new mayor and councillors attend cathedral service. And we find this elsewhere as well, like Leicester has the riding of the George, where mayors and aldermen ride around the town in finery. So again, this idea of not just protecting the people, but also kind of showing off how well off the knights and the supposed knights who've become administrators and bureaucrats are. And apparently in Leicester, for a while, it was like actually required that residents turned up to at least watch it, if not parade it. And often there's emphasis made on St. George's horse as well, like a white horse is found and dressed up in various finery. But again, the dragon is way more popular in Norwich. I found Ralph Whitlock in a calendar of country customs talking about, again, paradoxically, he says, I don't think it's a paradox at all, St. George is very much less in evidence than the dragon, which he's supposed to have vanquished. The dragon at Norwich is a traditional character named Snap, resplendent in green and gold and with wings of the conventional dragon type, who at other times resides in the Castle Museum. He follows the procession to the cathedral, but has to sit outside on the dragon stone. There's a dragon stone during the service. He has snapping jaws, which can be manipulated by the man inside, and causes much merriment as he capers about the streets. I love this. Yeah, Snap the Dragon. Yeah, I know a couple people that go to those kinds of things that could say far more about it than me. So again, like, parades love a monster, right? In various different ways.
Yeah.
Yeah. It also made me think of some of the not too, often mentioned at least by folklorists in the same breath as the osses in Padstow and elsewhere. And I know that's a particular interest of yours, Jesse, around like links to other like folkloric dance and parade and kind of guising and not quite guising, but definitely like masking and things like that. Yeah. And then, yeah. I don't know if you want to, like, sorry, there's another part I'm going to get into, which is going to be like, ugh. But yeah, is there anything you wanted to mention about that?
No, of course, pastoral nostalgia kicks in no matter what. And I'm reminded of conversations with Kat and just the idea of St. George's Day in the spring and St. George's Day in the fall. It's common when you get into the larger context, but like of, that's specifically Russian, I believe, of Yuri's Day in the spring, Yuri's Day in the fall, and the conflation there, the familiarity. But to have this like dragon on the way in, dragon on the way out, like the bads are gone. But also that Dorevdan, right? So the St. George's Day is just kind of, it is a feast where this is the spring feast. Easter is attached to this, and you'll even see on some calendars in various, both Catholic and Orthodox communities, where George's Day gets tied onto the Monday after Easter, regardless of whether or not you're celebrating the other feasts as well. So there's just kind of like, it's a big open-ended thing where George is just, this is the start. This is the start of spring. So I also know there's Hungarian lore here where witches attend a Sabbath on this day. And this is like leading into ideas of like, well, Purgisnacht in other areas too, where there's always these days where spring has started and the spring storms are starting. So I think there's a lot of interesting things there. I know there's a lot of masking traditions in Spain around this, and specifically in the Aragon area, which Aragon is, middle Pyrenees between Catalonia and Basque Country, and historically has ties to, again, your people for the disfortunate wife. But there's just, there's a lot of, George is a conveniently timed feast to celebrate a lot of things. And so if you're a ritualist and you got some things to celebrate or figure out or people to blame, there's going to be stuff here. You're going to build dragons. You're going to burn them. You're going to stuff people's names in it. Spain loves a good us versus them trope, as far as its masking, where everything becomes the enemy and it gets dressed up in these bestial ways.
Yeah.
Whether it's this is a saint that became extremely popular during the Reconquista as well, along Santiago Matamoros, so like Saint James the Moor Killer, who's technically the apostle, who reappears in a very, period appropriate costume and is leading the Christian armies of Spain against the Moors and to reconquer the peninsula for Christianity.
Mm.
So George is still tied into all of this as well. So it's such an interesting the idea of conquering, the idea of subduing, the idea of taming, the idea of patronage, of being right.
Yeah.
This
Yeah.
idea like George is on our side or whomever is on our side. So I like this weirdness of like coming out of the spring for us and diving in, but is still such that kind of Aryan nature of Aries in that way, even though his feast is after the into the Taurus, but like let's just say horned animals and their kind of like will to like I'm going to destroy what's in front of me. That we talk about needing in the tropical zodiacal references of needing the fiery Aries to break from the watery Pisces of the last vestiges of winter. You need that primal fire to push through. That's why Aries is the way it is. And George is a little bit cool. Like the blue is a different color, right? There's something different there, but
Yeah.
it's still so tied into like, okay, again, the Hungarian stuff, brilliant all over the place. But I remember that it's willow and birch twigs that are put in windows and stables, and like you burn whatever resins you can away to get witches. But like willow and birch are such superstitious trees, right? Like they have their utility, but
Mm.
like using full on witch, these are how witches get to their sabbats
Yeah.
is birch twigs and willows, and to be like, no, 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 you can't use our trees here. No, 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 we're starting our spring off correctly. And I don't know. I'm curious and have ideas of where you're going to go with Mr. George, but it's also such a day for reestablishing like correct order around things and
Mm.
correct way of thinking around things, a reconquering of your own rule sets and values and morals after you've been through the winter, right? These
Mm.
little bits are hard to get through. And we see those feasts in February that we've talked about, Agatha, Blas, Bridget, where like this is like checking in. How are we doing, everybody? Did you make it through the harsh? Because February is going to be shitty too,
Yeah.
but you still want to be able to be charitable and give to people who have not planned as well. So like did you make it through February and March? And now April, like spring is coming. We're going to be able to grow our own food again. Like the lambs have lambed. Like
Mm.
we can eat baby lambs, but like there's animals should be suckling at this point. There's signs of life. This is the groundhog. This is not a groundhog day. This is the promise of the groundhog. Like even if it's longer, we still should have. The bears are awake now, as it were. So I think there's so much interesting things there, and as it conflates, as we'll get into with Ganga, of George is for me is quintessentially tied to conceptions around protection, and therefore to this concept called the mayoral, whether it's celestial or infernal, and that you get a saint and his intrinsic nature of attacking
Mm.
and defending, defending the right way of being, whatever that mistaken conception is
Mm.
so tied into that it then informs things like Kimbanda and other cults in Brazil, where you have a saint informing the devil. And so it brings to mind entities like Ferrabras, right? Or Braço Forte, of like the strong arm that was the general of the Saracen army of the Moors, like in Charlemagne epic. And so this person is so good at what they do that they're called iron arm or strong arm. And that this becomes so embedded in like Iberian consciousness that this person must be allied to the devil. And so like this type of conception of Ferrabras as a demon that is still invoked, and it's like mostly just as like lip service, right? By Ferrabras, by Barrabas, Barabbas, by Satanas, these different ones. But there's something tying Ferrabras to St. George and any of these other saints that like their job is to defend.
Mm.
And I don't know that it's so popular in Rio, where we have a heavy Congolese influence, and Congolese conceptions of deity are less personality and more about active verbing of something.
Mm.
So George becomes about Georging, about defending. That
Mm.
to put the image itself, when we get this idea of like the simplicity or the overtrust upon of superstition that Catholics have, because it's not just about praying to the saint for protection, it's that the very nature of George as a saint invokes protection.
Yeah.
That any image of George provokes protection. So on that provocative side, what has it provoked for you?
Thank you. That's a wonderful link. Yeah, as is like the idea of like what happens when the saint is themselves demonized and then becomes picked up by those who would demonize others, right? When does the inclusive protection become exclusionary violence, right?
Well, we're both praying, like two people can pray to the same God and think that the other person's wrong. God's on your side. I mean, that's welcome to the history of the world.
Right. Again, Karen Armstrong, right?
Which has nothing to do with religion so much as just justifying what you do.
Yes. Well, the irony is, and this is, in terms of like personal anecdote stuff, growing up and seeing a St. George's flag on a house, unless, and again, from like the 90s onwards, it was more associated with, not more, but there was also association with European football tournaments and championships. That was a house of white nationalists. That was a house of people that did not like brown people. And this adoption by like extremists and the British National Party and a variety of their other more active and violent organizations was like, it has been pointed out as a weird thing that you would adopt a saint who was probably the same color as the people that you're throwing bricks through their windows. But it's interesting that this patriotic association with George in a way can be said to be right there from his adoption from the Synod of Oxford, but it doesn't save the English cultus of George being attacked and kind of dismantled across the 16th century in the Reformation, where all of the saints are, idolatrous and need to be torn down. Like just because he's the saint of sovereignty and the Order of the Garter and the king and chivalry and knighthood and all these concepts of English supremacy, he isn't rescued. But what that does do is it begins the long tradition of jingoistic English folk complaining that their countrymen aren't sufficiently patriotic. Right. That's where it starts to get tied up in this nationalism, not at its height, but as it falls out of favor. And there's all sorts of debate, like to this day, about whether or not we make a fuss about it. And partly that's definitely an embarrassment and shame at the ravages of like the British Empire's colonialism. Partly, yes, that's its adoption by, extremists. There's also this sense of like arrogance that you also see in like English conservatism of like not needing to make a fuss of our national pride because we already know we're superior, which is a weird extra one. And in terms of like the protection thing, I was reflecting on how like when you find yourself in or around a pub with a lot of St. George's flags on it, it's one of two things. It's either a pub that racists hang out, frankly, or it's a pub owned by English people of Asian or Indian subcontinental descent. And it's this thing around like trying to really highlight that you're very, very English and that, no, we're on your side. We don't like taxes either. And there's some like in the kind of comparison to like American politics, I think of Heems from Das Racist, a Queen's rapper of like Punjabi descent. On his beautifully titled album, Eat, Pray, Thug, he has this track called Patriot Act, which is about like 9/11 and how it changed like New York. And there's a second part of it's like spoken word where he's basically talking about his Punjabi dad being like, we got to put American flags up everywhere. We've got to be more American than Americans. And this sense of like both the kind of protection that can provide, but also the sense of like dislocation and having to police yourself of it. It's a weird thing that it does. I don't have any firm like, and that's why it's great, or that's why it sucks. I mean, obviously, these kinds of things are so challenging in terms of like what's identity, who gets to claim that, who feels comfortable claiming that. Like, what is I don't know, for me, national pride is always some sense of there's a performativity there. And then I think of like various folk singers who are trying to like reclaim St. George's flag from explicitly being something that you fly when you want people to vote British National Party. And again, of like, Billy Bragg's stuff around like half English is the most English you can be, right? The idea of like we're all from somewhere else. We've all been invaded so many times. Most of our saints aren't from here in various ways. And that like, trying to celebrate the cosmopolitan like mixing pot of England is like something I think, a lot of people can get behind. And that's reflected in how like it's on the one hand still a sign of like some of the more violent like football firms, but also of like bringing people together and, hating the French in football, for instance, So there's demagoguery and there's also a sense of like, if you can play well for the team, then obviously you're one of us. I don't know. It gets complicated.
Flying any flag for a football team is quite interesting, right? What those structures are, whether it's just the great capitalist flag of itself, which is usually my country's flag, right? The dollar sign coming from the symbol for mercenary was the oral lore that we were always taught. Yeah, there's a lot here. I think it's interesting because George is one of those things, like you said, that like a saint that is probably the same color of the people that are being persecuted in George's name. The feast, again, is so free because The saint is canonized by 500, died before 300. Like there's just, you do what you want to do with George, right? It's
Right.
and the date in the spring. I did remember a couple things more accurately, and just want to, because page 3 of your notes is not necessarily page 1 of your notes, but just to the George in the spring, George in the fall is often tied to the breaking of George on the wheel. One of his torturings is in November, and then the actual death is April, which then comes to on the other calendar as May, right? Early May. So this is as far as the spring's holidays and the Slavas that are around this in Serbia. And like, it's also a heavily Romani and Gorani day. It's celebrated by so many people in the Balkans, especially just of every ethnicity. Like George is like, we gotta agree that spring is starting. Like this is the thing. This is the first nice weather. Let's at least not ruin it. And
Yes.
as far as doing it to the Monday after Easter, it's specifically done this way in the Orthodox Church if it falls during Lent, meaning the feast day is so important that Easter cannot overshadow it completely. That if it's like during Lent and we didn't get to celebrate George's Day, we celebrate it the Monday after Easter and we just keep going. That's a tribute. Like that's East Mediterranean. Like we will not forget George here. Like this is some shit. There's a lot going on here, I think, and I like that it's so provocative. I like that there's things to be repulsed by and things to be attracted to, all within the same figure. And I am not well versed in the Muslim lore. I know that you brought up some of it. I know there's a Druze connection to George as well. I don't know. I think it's lovely to even go as far as that right there, of like, other than the Dracula mention, which I think is as far as talking about the eve of St. George on the 5th of May of this. But
yeah, the sense of like the coming of spring is the part that like I think I kind of returned to, as like, okay, yeah, there's something here that like makes sense to me. And in digging through the other like actual folk customs in England, like there's a couple mentions of like wearing bluebells or other blue flowers, because that's when they come up. And I love, we don't have to justify what we do by like some scientifically measurable thing, but like it's bluebell time when it's bluebell time, right? And I also found that like at least in Lincolnshire that was definitely the case, and kids would like wear them to school and stuff like that. And there was some findings, the weather lore specifically of it, that folklorists in I want to say the 60s, it might have been the 1860s, one of the century's 60s, I know it wasn't the 1960s, interviewed a woman who said that her mam used to say that it was the day to pick dandelions to make your wine, but only if the sun was full on them. So this idea of like you got to do it when the sun's actually up. And by the time you got like John Brand writing his Observations of Popular Antiquities, which is published in like 1913, he says that blue coats were formerly worn by people of fashion on St. George's Day, blue being the national colour of the national saint. I don't know if that's started by the Order of the Garter, or if that's just because, again, it's bluebell season then. There are other things. In Gloucester, they make a pie out of lampreys that they catch in the River Severn and present to the monarch, which, funnily enough, they claim it starts with Henry I, but it seems to tail off at the start of World War I, interestingly. But the other big thing, and this speaks of like dragons coming and dragons going throughout the year, is that it's George who gets slotted onto or becomes the face of the night in a lot of Christmastide mumming plays, which at least by the 70s was still claimed to be like pre-Christian in origin, specifically the death and resurrection drama of two men who from at least the 15th century are usually called the Turkish Knight and St. George. And they fight, and George is killed and brought back to life by the Doctor, this character called the Doctor, who comes to be a kind of comic figure as well, but is also referred to by a lot of folklorists as a medicine man, and occasionally as a cunning man. And other characters come and go. Like it's a mumming play, right? You're wandering around pubs doing it, and there's kids doing it. There's links to like the Starboys plays and stuff like that. So some good Magian business. And like any of those popular plays, they include like a bunch of satires. There are other characters in there. Beelzebub, probably from wider mystery play tradition stuff, but also like Father Christmas. There's a character I really want to find more out about called the Little Devil Doubt. But there's even like a bunch of like well-known and or reviled historical figures. Like Oliver Cromwell is quickly like played or like masqueraded grotesquely or whatever. Napoleon as well as figures that are like, considered national heroes like Lord Nelson and things like that. But in reading, say, Christina Hole in her Saints in English Folklore, she says it's the Doctor and the two fighting knights that are always the most important characters. And so this idea of like another death and resurrection that's happening not in a manger or a creche scene, but in pubs, while people are shouting loudly and often they have like sword fights and stuff like that. And yeah, this revelry for the idea of a knight who is slain or who's overcome and then comes back. So this idea of like the return of something, which again starts to take on some slightly like Brythonic and old British like Arthurian kind of dimensions. They're not made too explicit, but yeah, this idea of like fighting against something that you don't necessarily think you're going to win, and then the force of comic doctoring can bring you back to victory.
Which it's interesting. A couple of things come to mind is the Turkish soldier there, and it sparked my memory that I think it's Serbia, where St. George's Day is linked to the end of Turkish rule, so it kind of has a almost Reconquista parallel there in that way. But also that you reminded me that I think it's in the Orthodox Rom festivals going around this time that the use of or the eating of lamb specifically is because in the story is that when George kills the dragon, he's able to pull burnt lambs, because dragons breathe fire, out of the mouth of the dragons. So people just finish cooking them and eating them, and they find gold in the bellies, and everybody's rich type of thing. But the idea of eating lamb, because, well, he already cooked them halfway, so we might as well share them with people around us. That's extremely, I don't know why it's such a like a mumming thing, but it's like, let's make up let's celebrate the most absurd reason to celebrate.
Yeah.
And that also becomes part of the folkloric sacrosanct of how it goes. They're like, well, of course we do it this way because this is how it's always been done. And it may speak to historicity aside, like actual history, but as you said, the folklore being more than just the fact. When people ascribe something pre-Christian meaning, and that is part of the popular romanticization of something, that's part and parcel whether or not it's actually true. That should be looked at, is that people feel that they're getting away with something or something that they couldn't take this from us. What is the reason that that's being perpetuated as a reason?
Yeah.
In the same way that we've talked about with like Candlemas and candles and things that they're like that are reascribed and taken back and given it like this. There's something to all of that.
Yeah, I think so. And just more broadly, that if George is the force of fighting against, those that would poison our land, whether it's, racists claiming him about immigration or, hopefully more reasonable people, he said, betraying his own biases proudly. It's also an argument that's happening in folk music and football fields about fighting against, bigotry. So yeah, he's there fighting either way. So give him something to fight that you're willing to stand by him for.
Yeah, absolutely. Fascinating. Curiouser and curiouser. Yeah.
So maybe, from a saint that we've got so much lore about to and the demonizations of the things he's meant to stand for, to a demon that's very mysterious, even for a demon, Damostan or Damostan.
So, in full transparency, dear listener, I was like, well, this could be a wonderful place where we'll give ourselves enough time to kind of research who this Damostan figure is and go from there, with the understanding that most of our, and I think quite honestly, both of our familiarity with this Damostan figure is through the supposed syncretization as listed in Friswold's book, but which was referencing Lucio Fontanelli, which is a 1960 publication of book called Exu that was published that became the kind of, Kimbanda is this very dark, syncretized with European black magic. And in this book, in the 1960 publication of Lucio Fontanelli's Exu, we actually see the conflation with the Grimoiric Verum demons for the first time in print that any of us are aware of. Yeah. So this is not, will not be under some illusion that the roots of Umbanda are before Umbanda. The roots of Kimbanda are before Kimbanda. So like when these things across their spectrum get called these practices is a subject for the historians to debate, of which Al is one who's not debating those things, but just acknowledging.
Not yet.
You do have some authority here. But also it's kind of like I'm always called to mind that the creation of the Grand Lodge of England in 1717, it would imply that there were lodges of less grandness of Freemasonry before this point. So, what is called Kimbanda, what is called Umbanda, what are these things as far as codified terms within the Brazilian consciousness, and especially in their written record of the kind of great democratization that is called for in candle stores and like popular literature of like, I want to get a job, how do I get it? Let me go to the candle store and get a book and like do this spell. So the kind of grimoire content that gets started being recycling very heavily in the 40s, 50s, 60s, before things are kind of in Brazil taken back to what's the re-Africanization of things in the late 60s, early 70s. You see with Fontenelle a conflation with the hierarchy of the Grimoire Verum. However, it is not, we don't know what version he's working with. And I would posit, and it's something that I would love to continue to explore with you, Al, and we'll continue to do things. But like, you're one of the people who I know is more familiar with the Grimoire Verum than most people. And perhaps I know that there are many versions of it. However, it is still one of those things where like, why are these names in this order? That we can see that he switched some things over from one hierarchy to another side or different allegiances, which those flow charts are their own explanations and are obviously summaries of how someone's processing things written in a more prosaic paragraph formula. But I do think some of those flow charts do exist in some of the versions of the grimoires, at least by the time we get to now, yes. But the Damostan magically appears under duress, under the Hail side in Fontenelle. So he lists Hail, which he conflates with Exu Ganga. These are the sub in Kimana terms, the subgenerals, like the left and right hand of Omulu, or Omulu being death, and that he works his magic through Exu Caveira and Exu Meadows. So here known as Sergalat and Hail. And that under Hail you had a series of specific names: Sergut, Trimasel, Sustugriel, Eleogap, Damostan, Tharet Themis, Nelbirot, and Meramel, which some of those names do exist in a larger context of like we can find them in other editions of the Grimoire Verum. Yeah. But I think some are flipped in and you're like, wait, why are these listed in this way? Other than that, maybe there's a conflation. There's here in Fontenelle is where we start to wonder these names that were originally very unique to the spirits when they would identify themselves are now being kind of standardized. And so we go from a spirit that might call himself Father Midnight or Father Breaks Bridges or Father Broken Mountain or these things like that to now Broken Mountain. It was totally a Brokeback Mountain joke without me really trying. Sorry. The Child Eshu, Chili Pepper Eshu, Eshu of the Malay, Eshu Seven Mountains, Exu Ganga, Eshu Camino Loa, Eshu Quirombo, and Eshu Healer are, some of those I translated, some of those I didn't, are now underneath Eshu Meinoichi. And like it creates this thing where these spirits are in the manner of an Eshu Tata Caveira, in the manner of an Eshu Camino Loa. It's not a singular entity that is being called. It is a legion, of which this kind of understanding of legion allows these spirits to be called by these names that before may not have been the name they'd been called by. There's some really beautiful things to explore here in this literature alone, that this changes how Kimbanda is talked about, this book. Yeah. And there's a lot of romanticization, nostalgia, saudades for this type of book, which was published, up until the modern era still, of like, this is the old evidence of Kimbanda. But also a lot of people despise it and feel that it's pandering to trying to have to justify everything through a European lens. Yeah. Whether it's Afro-Indigenous or just African magic, or the great mixing pot that is Rio de Janeiro and its understanding of, if you look into cultural traditions and expressions of witchcraft, that Kimbanda is ultimately in this way, very Rio de Janeiro mixing of everything that came through it. Very orthodox candomblé traditions, more spirit pact based spiritual systems that are both African, some of them Muslim African, some of them quote unquote pagan African, mixing all these things together. All that said, this is where this thing of Damostan comes from. And if you Google Damostan, you're going to get people asking, does anybody know where this Damostan demon comes from that's syncretized with Exu Ganga? Like, I don't really need to know about Exu Ganga. I just want to know who the hell Damostan is and why do we don't have him in our Grimoire Verum lists. Yeah. I would also cite the one last list, and then I'm going to turn it over to you because I for the authority here. There is the lore, whether it's accurate or not. And because I do think that part of it needs to be acknowledged, there is lore that there are demons listed in Brazilian catalogs that are there because these grimoires or these families, the mythical hereditary families that came over from Iberia during the Reconquista, where they couldn't be overtly Jewish or Muslim or anything that wasn't, the Catholic Church, were given property or land in Brazil or absconded to Brazil with their knowledge and working pacts with demons to keep them safe, and that this is the origin of some of the European witchcraft elements that you find in Brazilian popular magic. I think that's a really over-romanticization, oversimplified version of how these things go. But there is lore out there that there's versions of the 72 of the Pauline art, the Lemegeton of that there's more than just the 72. They're like, well, you broke with the symbolism of 72 there. That's a thing. But that there's footnotes, or that legion spirits give their new names or things like that.
Yeah, and that these books were worked and
yes.
that more spirits emerged. Yeah.
Yes. And that part I do, that's the part that's interesting to me. Not the claim to have, well, we have more, but no, we have difference because it's been worked.
Yeah.
And that it was already underground and kept being underground. So I would allow that maybe there is a proposal that Damostan is one such demon that is just like somebody had, but I also don't know the history of the Grimoire Verum within, a Lusophonic community. Like, how is this within Portuguese speaking magic in this way? So again, you can play into the histories that are given by various things, as well as the people who justified seeing it in this book. But the truth of it is that I have no fucking clue where Damostan comes from. I can talk to you about Exu Ganga. I have no clue who Damostan is. And I'm not knowledgeable of most of the Grimoire Verum demons. But I was kind of like, maybe Al will find something. And so I'll lead in with that question. Al, what did you find?
Well, I think what's most interesting here is exactly that point about many grimoires point out that these aren't all the spirits that you could work with. These are just the ones that we've met, or these are the best ones, or these are the ones that are easiest to work with. And I think it's very significant that Damostan turns up in Fontenelle in one of the first places that we have the Clavicular Solomonis de Secretis manuscripts that become the Grimoire Verum manuscripts, saying exactly that. So the structure that's most commonly understood to be taken up by Fontenelle, etc., is one that we do find very familiar throughout most, if not all, of these earlier manuscripts of three chiefs, right, of Lucifer, Beelzebub, and Astaroth. In earlier forms, that's Astaroth is Elastor, but there's a mutation around there which clearly suggested it seems to be the same chief, the same Grand Duke of Hell, or Grand Duchess, if you prefer. After these three chiefs, you have the 6 dukes, originally they're called, but deputies, and then you have the 18 under them. After that, even in early manuscripts of the Secrets of Solomon, the Clavicular Solomonis de Secretis, you have this section where it says there are other demons, right? There are, for instance, 54, of which 4 are the principal ones, and the magic can be adapted by us, but we remain silent about the rest because it would be pointless to expand. And that's where they bring in the first of what I've called before now, the second lines of other sets of spirits that aren't directly related to the 18, for instance. So that's where you get Surguthi as distinct from Sergalath and Sergat. There's a bunch of those spirits that sound the same and aren't. Heramael, who's also then becomes Miramael by Fontenelle's manuscript, whichever he's working from. Irmasael or Trimasael, the chemist, and Sestugriel or Sefugriel, clearly basing it off the Shaftest S's, right? And then they list Elelagap is also mentioned there sometimes, who exists in the hierarchy, but as not part of the initial standard flow of things from the 3 to the 6 to the 18. And then you also get Hale and Sergalath, who also are said to have between them in the earliest forms, it seems, these 8 other spirits, Procolo, Haristum, etc. And so this is the point again where they're saying there are plenty of other spirits and you can get hold of them, but the principal ones that we have met before are these ones. So I don't want to say just because, again, I have not worked with Damostan. He doesn't turn up in the manuscripts of Verum and De Secretis that I've worked most thoroughly. But I don't want to say just because we can't find a historical record so far, I don't want to engage in this historical purism that reduces grimoires to just a bunch of things a bunch of people wrote down, right? That they are always markers or records of the predecessors of our grimoire practices work. They are the record of spirits crossing human time and space, and preferably the reliable ones that turn up by that same name and do the same kind of thing so that you can write their office, right? The spirit work comes first and the writing it down comes afterwards, right? As these are formulated. And as they change, sure, there are points at which we know that there seems to be typos at which that splits things. But again, we can't just look at it as historians of the transmission of these publications. We also have to think about it as animists and as practitioners, if we are practitioners. And so, is a Glioraptor Chimath right? One deputy becoming a gliorept takimaki. What happens when that one name gets split by what's almost certainly a typo into another office, and the hierarchy of the places of the six deputies shifts? Well, in my mind, that doesn't mean that spirit isn't real. It means that you've just created a space you've just created prime real estate, and something is going to move in there. To Jake's understanding, it was probably Lucifuge Rafakale. That's the sigil he used for Takimaki, and it works just fine, right? Something will answer to that name because it's given power over other spirits. So something will turn up, something had turned up and worked it. And so again, just because we can't find Damostan, I really don't want to suggest that means that this is a made-up spirit of some sense like that it reflects, that someone worked it and thought it enough to write that down, right? And again,
absolutely. I think that's I'm glad you said that. I think of note here, because by the time Kimana gets written about heavily, especially in the English era, but within the Anglophonic community, within, post 2000s especially, I think it's important to note here that it's page 108 of Fontenelle, where the catalog of the spirits is given. It is not given as Exu Ganga. It's given as Damostan, parenthetically Exu Ganga. He controls the orders. He actually says despachos, but I'll come back to that in a minute. Orders that are made in the cemeteries. When work is done to kill or save a sick creature, he appears in gray and black clothing, and his smell is that of decomposing flesh. That's the description of Damostan. Exu Ganga is a parenthetical to that. And here Fontenelle is kind of proposing that there's an equivalence here, or an equivalence to the point where they are the same entity as might be known in the European sense or in the African sense. We know that there's already a lot of things going on there because Eshu itself is a borrowed deity name. It's not necessarily the same thing going on here. And there is a distinction in this time period between what is called Eshu Orisha and Eshu Kiyumba, or Eshu Ogun Egum. So the dead posing as Eshu versus Eshu, the god force. And that's in contemporary literature that's going on at this time. But I do think it's worth noting that he is describing Damostan. First and foremost, the lens is through the demon. That doesn't mean that he's actually coming off of another source there. He could be describing Exu Ganga, but his predilection is to list the demon first. Yeah. Despacho is specifically a very Brazilian term here in this way, because despacho is to dispatch. It's to put something into the cemetery, to you go to where the spirit is and you dispatch them from there. It's giving them orders. You might also, a despacho might be, the despachar could also be to take the energies out of the temple area and return them to the crossroad. So these notions of orders, it's just, there's a little more context when the Portuguese word is despacho, even though it's probably going to be translated as orders by Santo Google and others. Yeah, I think what you're saying is really important because, again, following even this line here with Fontenelle, it means that people are called to this spirit using this book as Damostan. Yeah. Right or wrong. And this is one of the great conflictions. I have my ideas about how Kimbanda works. I have experience prominently in 2 lineages and I'm familiar with, a dozen others. But I don't conflate the demons with the issues in that way. There are people that do, but they don't necessarily follow this specific syncretism in this way. I've seen not just as many. I've seen people that use the 72 for primary descriptions. I've seen people that use the 72 to continue making syncretisms for spirits that are not listed here in this book. So I think there's a lot of justification backwards and forwards. My experience is that when the emphasis is put upon the European sigil and name and way of working, that something, a shift happens. Whether the spirit is adapting to us or we to them, I don't know. And we can talk about that, and that's the fun part of sitting in a rocking chair for the rest of our lives. Well, not as an imprisonment. Having good conversations in rocking chairs on a porch as an option to participate in for the rest of our lives, let's say. Yeah. So without going too much, and there's not much written on this spirit otherwise. You do see some of it in Sorcerer's Transmission of St. Cyprian, briefly, right, by Nick, which is a little bit more of a whirlwind, that book. It's hard to follow the through line there, but he does Dumavati, amongst other things.
Yeah, he links it to Plancy's entry in Dictionary Infernal of Duomo, or Dumas, this devil adored under the name of Dumas. She wears a crown, has 4 horns on her head and 4 fangs. Her nose is pointed and hooked, and she has the feet of a rooster, and she holds a soul between her claws, ready to devour. Okay. And
which then, of course, is going to go to the Dumavati, as Mahavidi goes. I think, and feel free to keep interjecting about Damostan. I'll use it as a segue to talk about Ganga Force here. Yeah. Because I think within some lineages and some expressions of Kimbanda Jangola or Kimbanda Brasileira, you kind of see this Ogun, meaning St. George, impulse that kind of fills this Bolja Ganga notion, the people of Ganga. And Ganga is coming from Nganga, which is a healer, diviner, priest in the Kikongo languages, Kimbundu, all these other things that are present in Brazil. So the first wave of enslaved Africans is always attributed to Congo Angola, Congo Bantu Angola, and they're there the earliest. That is that root paradigm that informs what becomes considered Kimbanda later on, and heavily Umbanda, even though they tried to over-Yorubize it eventually. But Ganga itself becomes synonymous with the forces that heal, the forces that change energy from one thing to another. Povo de Ganga can be a term that's describing all Eshus and Pombagiras, or any spirit that kind of protects and heals you from danger or poverty or disease or whatever it is. So Ganga becomes this transformative name. It is also a very specific spirit in this case. You also get the understanding that Exu Ganga can fill a very, and specifically Pombagira Ganga as well, Mulambo Ganga, can fill a very São Jorge-like role for the people that are working Kimbanda as separate from Umbanda, where there's saints and conflation with Orisha in a popular way, and as separate from Candomblé, which is working with Orisha, Fodu, and Kisi in an extremely orthopraxic manner, akin to the religions, the African religions as they modified and survived and adapted within Brazilian soil. So Exu Ganga as a force is as described here in Fontenelle. Black and gray, wears sometimes rags, sometimes hides and furs of things. He has his corresponding Exu Ganga, sometimes Exu Mulambo. Mulambo, it means rags. You have Maria Mulambo, who's a popular Pombagira as well, Mary Rags. You have Tata Mulambo, who is an older form of Maria Mulambo and is a little more witchy in the cemetery. So you'll see Exu Ganga sometimes be called Exu Mulambo, or Maria Mulambo also called Mulambo Ganga in some qualidades and some avatars where she is a little bit more fierce and about correcting things. Maria Mulambo herself is given this kind of title of queen of the Mosorobi in the sense of glamour and transformation and all those, I wished for a bigger ass, but I can change my eye color craft magics are, those are important things of changing appearance is still magical. And Maria Mulambo is one of the quintessential Pombagiras who's she doesn't reject people. She'll always be there for people. But she has this fiercer aspect of Mulambo Ganga that works with Exu Ganga and is about balancing out the polarity of things. And popularly, you'll see Exu Ganga being talked about the equilibrium of the environment, the one that is related to taking the sacrifices out where they need to go and not being influenced by them, which has a specific kind of connotation. And then Maria Mulambo or Mulambo Ganga being very much about the equilibrium of people and balancing out people within a space. So they become patrons of, and I guess within Kimbanda Jongola and a few other lineages, it becomes this idea that Kimbanda was used primarily for defensive and retaliatory magic within the Umbanda compounds. When you are a Kimbandero first and foremost, your Kimbanda becomes everything. So you still have this role that's needed for defensive magic by the door that gets assumed by the Bolja Ganga of this kind of force that balances out the temple and the space, that is not just, you're not just using your Exu Pombagira who are giving you spiritual insight and becoming kind of very, very akin to familiar spirits in that way, the ancestralization process, but you're also giving certain spirits roles whereby those spirits protect you. Those spirits are gone to for protection. And it's complex, but Exu Ganga is one of those ones that, like Maria Mulambo, people go trash, is it just being a trash queen and a dumpster diver? No, garbage itself, the concept of decay is an incredibly beautiful food for thought to think about how important it is that things decay and go away. And that otherwise we'd be, up to our armpits in dead bodies. And that part of this lore around this is to understand the importance in a cult that does blood sacrifice, in a cult that makes food offerings that will also rot the temporality of life, that the ability of these things to break down, for nature to be able to break these things down, continue life from those things. This is an incredibly beautiful prismatic mystery that is necessary to really dive into if you are going to be Kimbandero, Macumbeiro, of this way of understanding the importance of spirits like Exu Ganga, of Mulambo Ganga, and these spirits that are able to transform energy of a space, energy of people, as well as just transforming one thing to another state. I kind of went on a little blah, blah, blah there, but
No, no, beautiful. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the not just putrefaction mysteries in the sense of like the cold flame of fermentation, but like the transformation of one thing to another as part of a continuous cycle of various sorts that you get to engage with.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting because Ganga is usually associated with two kingdoms, the cemetery and the harp. But he walks in all kingdoms, and the kingdoms themselves are their own kind of addition, similar to the syncretism with the grimoire. It's like any of these groups, one of the greatest things that happened with the spiritist traditions, of which Kimbande is truly a spiritist tradition, or let me say spiritual tradition, not spiritism in the sense that it's not coming from Kardec. Umbanda was very allied to Kardecian spiritism, but these temples are all individually modified, run, and adapting to their specific spirits that they are talking to. So while there are codified ideas about what spiritism is, in the hands of an Umbandista, they may feel they're doing pure spiritism, but the minute you start incorporating these other elements from these other traditions, something's different. And this is where you see a spectrum from like the most kind of quote unquote low spiritism, which is basically mediumship where people are talking to a spirit that we don't know the origin of and they have a relationship with and it does things, which is the very quote unquote African way of doing things, to the most spiritist, like quote unquote high spiritism, meaning scientific spiritism and this kind of thing that was bourgeois safe, and the Umbandistas where there's a whole history that we can go into in that. But I think what's coming out of all that, or where I was trying to go with that, fuck if I know, but just the notion that through all of these contacts, that something that's keeping the tradition alive is the practice itself, which echoes what you were saying earlier about like continuous practice of a grimoire will bring annotations to someone, will bring more expressions of that practice. And that the best intentions of setting up a Teiro of Umbanda, if you're following very cardicist and very strict lineage and training, really what it is your lineage is showing how you were trained, if anything else, because you're going to be able to do whatever the hell you want with it. It's if it's your temple. It's kind of like you can educate your children, you can bring them to a certain value center, but at a certain point, if they move out, it's their house and they're going to do what they want in their own house. And this kind of open sourced, I often say open source golden dawning that is really Umbanda of like, you put it in people's hands and now there's spirits involved, like it's going to go crazy real quick. And it did. Mm-hmm. So all that to say is that one person's understanding or categorization of how these powers work, like kingdoms or synchronization with demons, doesn't necessarily mean that it's universally practiced. But if you bring it back, it is going to be redisseminated and put through the eternal filter of pragmatism within each group. Because theory only gets us so far when we're dealing with possession cults. Because that spirit is still going to come down in some form and shift things.
Yeah.
And that is part of the beauty of it, that it's reinterpreted and revivified through the repertoire of its performance. The archive doesn't win out here. We can't just be like, oh, this is the way it was always done. The way it's always is that it's now going to be, let's see what the spirit has to say. Call the spirit and ask.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think there's something really beautiful about that in league with the Ganga mystery, even here, in league with St. George, and league with all these things of like, what's going to come through again here?
Yeah. And exactly. What do we want to come through again? What's going to heal? Right. Yeah. What's going to fight for us? What's going to be something that we can work with?
Which I'm happy to continue talking Ganga or Damostan here, but I think that ties a little bit into our flower, especially as far as crocus being an early soil penetrator after the winter has passed.
Yeah. That's a great transition. Yeah, I love that.
They are very low flowering. The stems generally remain underground and pierce through the old leaf layers or whatever it is. But crocuses are a sign that spring is irreversibly coming. Mm-hmm. And we have there's this monetarization of Crocus sativus, which is an autumn crocus. Actually, it's not a spring crocus, but that's where saffron is. That's the dried stigma there. But crocuses, as far as like here, when we get snowdrops, and the next phase is going to be crocuses, usually purple and pink here in upstate New York, or central Hudson Valley, New York. Upstate, if you're from Manhattan, just the Hudson Valley if you're from the rest of New York, before I piss off people even more. But somewhere between there and, like the daffodils that are now coming up because it's late March, early April. But crocuses have been here for a good month. And there's a lot of lore around them because of this too, and that hope that comes.
Yeah. They're one of the big spring arrivals. Yeah, just like it's often. I grew up hearing that the snowdrop is the first flower of spring, but it's quickly followed by, like you say, like the daffodils and the crocuses and things. Yeah, so
Yeah.
all of that folklore of spring's arrival, the rot of winter has passed, and now something else is growing from it. So all of this like rebirth, hope, joy, even like romance, right? As spring turns to, bouncing lambs and the way you get bouncing lambs, the spring crocus being associated in like God wise with the botanical theurgy of it, of Venus and Eos of the dawn and Persephone as Kore coming back and Aphrodite, as well as with like Venus, but also Mercury, right? Like again, the transition of one thing to another, the far darting one who can come back from the underworld back into the world, right? Yeah. And again, this split between, again, seeing like what happens in spring and what happens in autumn, right? Or what happens in the rise of the dragon and the fall of the dragon, we might say, or the dragon's second head, or however we want to put that, right? So yeah, like the links with saffron do need to be talked about in terms of the terminology itself, right? So crocus is krokos in Greek, is karkom in Hebrew, is kurkama in Arabic, and is Kirkham in Arabic and Persian. Please forgive my total lack of appropriate accents there. But you see it in speaking grimoirically, like the Heptameron and the Elucidarium Necromantia manuscripts before it have crocus as the perfume of Thursdays and of Jupiter work. And sometimes that's translated as straight up saffron, and sometimes it's crocus meaning saffron. And so yeah, this distinction between crocus sativus, right, from which we can derive the saffron as spice and as dye. And so this association of like these rich golds that you can make with it, assuming you're using like alum or some kind of thing to make it fast, otherwise it will fade. And for me, I'm mostly familiar magically with working saffron, for delicious meals, which should the magical value of which should not be understated, but also Jupiter work and kind of prosperity stuff. It's intensive to make it, right? You need thousands of flowers to produce like a single ounce of saffron, but also like many cooks say like you only need a few threads of it, and the flavor doesn't get stronger the more you use. There's just like a certain saturation point, at which point it's often said that it just wastes money, right? It's the idea of like you can't just throw money at something to make more money necessarily. You need to work with what you have in the way it will work. So yeah, the idea of bringing in that richness of it, the expenditure on it to be able to offer it as incense, where like, you might need to burn a lot of it. It's not going to do the same things it's going to do in cooking. Yeah. And you get it associated with Jupiter heavily. That's one of Ashmole's main go-tos for his Jupiterian suffumigations, which he also talks about specifically as vivifying. He says like that suffumigation is not just about signaling to spirits, it's about giving, he says, vivification to the astrological sigils that he was casting. It's this idea of like, not just saffron, all of these, but like, saffron's a good example here of like, you're giving life to something as well. You're not just signaling to spirits. You're not even just burning it in Agrippa's sense of the importance of breath and of incense being something that you breathe in and then ennobles you to be able to say the right words better, right? It's not just priming you, which is the other mutual aid thing or mutually assured destruction thing about incense that I find so fascinating. But that like, it's helping something take its first breath as well. And that talisman is now alive in some sense and can do what it does because it was properly vivified.
Sorry about my ding ding there. I think there's obviously there's a lot of lore within, because it's written down, right, of Greek deities and Roman deities that are associated with saffron. You get, notably within the witchcraft community right now, is the understanding that Hecate wears saffron-colored robes.
Yes.
Which is, pulls her out of the dark-clad crone goddess ideas of the 80s and 90s, but the association with light and the dawn and the solar heritage of Hecate, of Circe, of Medea, in that way, that, the deity herself was as much solar as lunar, but associated later on with the lunar. I think you get the dawn itself, which is very much describing her horse as saffron-colored, her throne is saffron-colored, her dress is saffron-colored, her countenance is saffron-colored, because she's the dawn. But Hecate and most of Artemis's entourage have some mention of saffron in some way. And part of this, I think, is just the preciousness of saffron itself as a thing, and the idea of virginity that is tied to Artemis. It's also describing the hair color of certain people, Ariadne, meaning reddish hair or blondish hair. The daughters of Helios, who helped Demeter in her grief, were also saffron hair colored. Iphigenia wears it before her sacrifice. Helen of Troy is associated with it because there's a veil that she wears that's saffron colored, which was a gift from Leda of Leda and the Swan. Antigone wears the yellow dye. Heavily associated, the crocus itself was the flower of the Erinyes, and the Muses also wore it. Dionysus also wore it, who is an effeminate god. Let's be very clear. As far as gods going wearing it, Dionysus is a cross-dresser, and happily so. Modern depictions where he's always just like bedecked out and hyper-masculine, sure, but the dude would be wearing a dress, happily, or at least a sarong. So there's a lot going on there of like crocus blooms underneath Hera and Zeus when they consummate their marriage. It's one of the plants that grows where the gods reside because they blessed the land. So crocus is just, I'm reminded of, the musical is not so, the book is terrible, but the music is great from The Secret Garden, which has the clusters of crocus song, which is a prominent motif that comes back off and on. Clusters of crocus, purple and gold, blankets of pansies, out from the cold, lilies and iris, safe from the chills, safe from my garden, snowdrops so still. So the coming, spring is coming and all of the other things. This constant idea of renewal that happens and is tied to crocus. I'm also interested always is like, I think any etymology nerd is linked to just the history of colors and foods, which is how we get into, and saffron being yellow, right? That we can't take saffron away from it's just yellow. This is how we get yellow dye.
It's the yellow gal. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's something there. Just there's saffron colored robes within Hinduism, within Tibetan Buddhism, with many Buddhisms in general. But just it's beautiful to have these things linked to colors in this way and foods. And I think specifically the Hecate link is the Orphic hymn itself, right? Like Celestial, Plutonium, and Oceanic, and the Lady of the Saffron Robe. That light filters on all things.
Yeah. And the more that folks dig in through the Chaldean oracles, the more the world soul stuff, as well as specifically like Cleidocox and stuff like that. Yeah.
I do find as a Mexican granted, what we call Mexican rice is tomato influence. Like I've seen people use everything from fresh tomatoes all the way through ketchup to color the rice. But some people say it's just for coloring to make it kind of orangish yellowish. And some people say, no, you can do it right. It's for the flavor, which I agree. It can be for flavor. But within the larger Spanish culture, we have saffron rice, which is such a common thing. And so it's interesting to think of this using this precious substance, as you said, just a few threads to change the flavor of things. And there's so many different variations of saffron rice, quote unquote yellow rice within Spanish culture, which is, has a lot of añato and things like this added to kind of give the yellow. But ultimately, if you have good saffron, this is flavor and color right there. And so we know that this is a Moorish influence in Spanish culture and kind of gets distributed from there. And sometimes you'll find different versions in it, nuts in it and things like this. But, from everything from paella to putting seafood and things like this, or to just adding some color to the plate of what it is to cook rice with rose water and then add a savory on top of it. So the consummation of the crocus in this way, consumption, but Zeus and Hera's consummation as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the strands of light also makes me, I don't know, there's a backtribution here of like, it's placed in the Iris family, right? And Iris is a rainbow goddess, right? Sometimes linked to Mercury as well. So this sense of not just the yellowing of specific yellow things, but the yellowing of the dawn of spring that brings all of these colors to bear. There's something in that I think's quite beautiful as well, along with the idea of like, you can do a lot with a little, right? And magic, especially folk magic, is often about doing as much as you can with as little as you have.
I think the magical implications here are quite easy in that sense, right? Of renewal and coloring in general, preciousness, patience, things like this that are happening with saffron. Money, definitely, and light in general. Something about virginity and initiation is very commonly a theme within saffron and yellow of saffron.
Yeah.
Kind of esoteric transformation of things. It is distinctly not just a faded white, but a vibrant yellow. Vibrant yellow orange. And that is what's interesting to me. Ironically, as much as saffron and crocus have their kind of such a specific thing comes to mind, then our stone jasper is like the opposite in many ways.
Yes,
jasper comes in so many varieties, and it almost gets felt to be almost too common
Hmm.
especially by the Western magical mind, right? It's not like oh, it's just Jasper, whatever.
Yeah.
Like, wait a minute, let's be very clear here. Jasper is a fundamentally, it's a biblical stone as
Hmm.
it's translated. Here's in Revelation, it's talked about as being on the breastplate. There are different colors and versions of it. It is one of the favorite semi-precious stones of the ancient world. And that's because it's prevalent, but like it does clean up well. It does carve well. It holds a charge apparently strong enough for people to be very happy with it.
Yeah, there are so many things that get carved on it. Yeah, all sorts of stuff. Gosh, often images of Mars or a warrior, as well as kestrels, hares are popular, stags and hunters, wolves, things like that. Yeah. And I guess, yeah, I say partly because like Marbode of Rennes identifies like 17 varieties, which then becomes pretty popularly repeated in lapidary lore. Yeah, it's a chalcedony, right? And so while those are often brown in color, you can find it in shades of gray and blue, white, bull, pink, red, orange, and yellow. But what we get from an awful lot of the lapidaries is it links to the green one being best. So Leonardi's Speculum Lapidum claims that jaspis means green, and he says that this is the best color for doing magic. And again, links it to emerald, as we discussed last time. Dioscorides even says that it's so similar to emerald that it's also guarded by griffins, which is fun. The Peterborough lapidary says that it's the one that's spotted with red but is green that is the lord of all jaspers. So this idea of like, yeah. So you got bloodstone connections, as well as this idea of like, what do we have when we have a legion? We find the one that can marshal the others, right?
Yeah.
Which I find really fascinating. And that spottedness is interesting because that's the other link that etymologists make, that it's from the Latin jaspidem or the Old French jaspre, meaning spotted or speckled stone. And there's arguments that that comes earlier from like Assyrian ashpu or even Hebrew yashpe. But it's said that the translucent green one or the green one spotted with red is best. And it's linked to youthful vigor, to victory, to blood staunching. It isn't so much a stone that will produce purity, but it requires purity. And you also find it having particular applications as a contraceptive as well. So along with healing fevers and dropsy, again, dealing with like the matters of heat, it's said to eliminate lust and even prevent women from conceiving. Mandeville says it makes women sterile, but there's also versions that facilitate childbirth and are contraceptive. So the Speculum Lapidum of Leonardi clarifies that it's green with, get this, saffron veins that's helpful to the pregnant to give birth. And the Peterborough lapidary says that if you behold it through daylight, so again, the sense of looking upon the green and the green as ennobled by the sun, that it specifically like speeds up childbirth and makes it happen quicker.
And I'm sure, unless I dozed off for a second, which I would not be my intention, the Magi lore connected to it.
Yeah. Casper, which is also written as Gasper, is also written as Jasper very commonly. Yeah. So it becomes a written emblematic of one of the, not always, because again, there's always a young one, a middle-aged one, and an old one. They're not always the same, but Jasper, Casper, Gasper is commonly the younger one. And so this idea of like the link to youth, it's Jasper specifically that we find carved around the older Sator square that we find all through early modern English stuff, but you can find it especially in the Folger Book of Magic, published as the Book of Oberon. That version of the Sator square has the Sator square in a circle and the names of the magi around it, but because there's 3 magi and 4 places for it to go on the 4 like sides of the square, it's Jasper repeated. So we get him twice, interestingly, in some versions of it.
I think it was the conflation of Jasper as a Persian word meaning treasurer that I found interesting. And, you know, in that way, because magi are always going to be transferred to this Persian heritage in not always, they just often are. And this notion of it being used for birth is fascinating because the magi sealed they are the announcement that the birth of the Christ has happened.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that like, if there's a lore there around that of like, you know, if someone's struggling with birth, they'd be like, but the kings are already here, ma'am. You like, maybe let's come into the world. Like, I love that type of folk magic where like you're showing what would normally be the announcement of something as to get it done. Hurry up. Let's get this done.
Yeah. Kind of reversing the order of causality. Right. If this has happened, then this must also be happening. Right. There's so much conjuration that's like that. Right. Not just as you did this before, so you do it again, but like it's here as you gave the magi gifts. So do you give me gifts, God? right? As the Magi found the thing, so I will find the thing, which is not just detection, but extrapolated from at least the 12th century in prayers to have your heart's desire, as it says. Another bit of wonderful little, what I think of as Magi lore, is along with a bunch of stuff around both preventing conception and aiding in the travails of birth. It's also claimed that it causes camel's milk to flow specifically. I haven't found it referencing any other animal that it helps lactate. It's camels all the way. And I love me some camel lore, especially, Magi style. Yeah. You find it used for other bits and pieces. Again, reducing the hotness of things, dispelling inflammation, heart palpitations even, as well as banishing lust. And from there's a bunch of other ways that it's said to reduce certain kinds of pollution or to convert them into something good. It's often said that it will do its best work, which can be often summarized as keeping a person from adversity or adversities or adversaries even, but only if they are living purely. But if you are living purely, it's said that it comforts those troubled by phantoms, as well as staunching bleeding, as well as staunching menses, which might be, again, a link back to various forms of causing sterility or cultivating a contraception. It's often debated as to whether or not it should be set in silver or gold. I've seen more sources in silver, but sources do seem pretty unanimous that it should be worn on the right-hand side, and that especially once you've blessed it and consecrated it, it should be worn chastely, right? You put it down when you're having sassy moments. It's also said to be good against not just venom and poison, but also on our dragon slaying tips, specifically worms and sometimes even widowns. So there's some dragon biz in there. As you said, it's on the breastplate of Aaron, and so a lot of Christian lapidaries talk about it both as the young vigor of the faithful and also as the first foundation of the kingdom of heaven realized through Jerusalem. And this link to faith is also reiterated with Conrad of Hamburg in his Annulus, which I think we've mentioned before. It's his big lapidary poem, The 20 Stones for the Blessed Virgin Mary, where it's said specifically to signify the faith of, and by extension in, the Virgin Mary. So a bunch of connections to youthful vigor, but also restraining vigor, that it's on the right lines, that it's charging towards the right enemy, that you can carve martial stuff into it, but it's not exclusively a martial thing.
Interesting. Okay. Is there more to add? It's pretty thorough. What are you going to do?
It prevents drowning as well. There's some specific links to watery stuff that those in danger of water can use it as well. So again, this idea of working against the crocodiles that lurk in the waterways, or the dragons that are poisoning us from the sea.
Which is not a myth in New York. There were alligators in the sewers. I love seeing the old articles about this. Letting pets. It was not uncommon, mail order wise, for people you could order a baby alligator via the mail.
Yeah.
Eventually, you just flush it down the toilet because that's what you did. So there were actually alligators in the sewers of New York. It was not completely fabricated.
Yeah. There's I can't remember the name. I think either a Finnish or a Swedish folklorist did a fantastic study on those kinds of wild animals in the civilized sewers, and started with, again, a myth doesn't have to be factually true, but sometimes it also proves to be, but likened those to the earlier Victorian myths about pigs in the sewers, which will sometimes prove to be true, and even goes back. And the reason I got into it, because it links it to stories from Albion in the 1st century of octopuses coming up from the sewers to eat the cured fish. And it is a direct parallel of what I call the Phantom of the Aquarium stories, which seem to emerge from San Francisco Aquarium, where the fish are going missing. They put cameras in, or they get someone to stay overnight, and it's the octopuses that have not only learned to get out of their cages, get into the tropical fish cages, eat their fill, but then also slither back and lock themselves back in and kind of do the equivalent of a cephalopod, nonchalant whistle. And this is exactly the same stories that Albion tells about the fish are going missing in albeit cured fish of fishermen and merchants. And they get a guy to stay overnight and tells this monster story of this octopus that has acquired a taste for the rarefied, often saffron laced fish of humans, and how this and she goes into awesome detail about what this says about civilization resting on what we wash our hands of, and which decays and rots underneath us, right? Of the sewer system being the point at which the wild will reclaim civilization first, right? So a bunch of different themes coming kind of together there for me, at least.
Yeah. I know we're kind of taking a backseat, or at least a sly, more influential, less overt geomantic role here. But I picked this one for a few reasons. Cauda, one, because of, there's dragon lore on the George end. And I also found it amusing that it kind of looks like a crocus because of the long stem and the flower
Oh
opening up.
yeah,
Um,
absolutely. Yeah.
then also because at the time of this recording, which is early April, we are about to witness the Great American Eclipse, as it were,
Mm.
which is a North Node eclipse. So this is solar lunar Aries conjunction to make an eclipse that is along the ascending node. So this is the actual Caput, Draconis here, in addition to being a Harry Potter sorcery word. And I guess where I was going with that is my brain then goes like, okay, so it's interesting time. This is a Caput Draconis time, like in
Mm.
a way that is tangibly here. Like, yes, we get planetary strengths and dignities and essential rises and fallings and things like that. But here is like, this is when the nodes exert themselves, right? It's the whole point is that the potentials where eclipse happens. They are fictitious bodies. And
Mm.
yet dramatically, geomantically, like we are about to witness a huge one. And I find all of that quite interesting. I also, in the sense of like being the Latin of Caput Draconis, of this is also a reference to 3/4 stars in the constellation Draco, right?
Mm.
Which is its own. If you want to go into conspiracy theories, look into circumpolar stellar lore because like those stories just kind of overlap by necessity around the world, right? There's no way to get around them. So perhaps some of the oldest stories there are that we have evidence of. But the idea that it refers to like Rastaban, Kuma, Grumium, and Eltanin specifically. So you're dealing with like the stars that make up the head of the dragon itself. I don't know. I think that there's some interesting things here and the correspondences that certain magicians have made, Chumley amongst others, with the correlation between the dragon stars and the Behenian stars that are there as corresponding or tied up, and that those also have folk expressions too in various cultures as well. So to think of Kata and Caput Draconis as also being referential to stars within Draco, or as analogs or perhaps divine ray extensions of the so-called Behenian stars, which are, a sweet spot of mine. But
Mm.
this idea of Caput Draconis of just being the tempest of the head, right? That the body is in alignment, everything's going good, but this head is a storm. It
Mm.
contains nothing. It
Mhm.
contains everything, therefore, at the same time. And I think there's something to as far as a figure apart from its geomantic meaning, but its geomantic meaning, of course, reflects this lore strongly.
Yeah, so closely. Yeah. It's one of the examples of exactly that of it being literally an astronomical term as well as an astrological, set of considerations. There are arguments by some anthropologists of geomancy that many of the terms come from astrological terms. The idea of like the joy of Laetitia being originally about or being influenced by the very notion of exaltation. That geomancy didn't just borrow astrological correspondences in terms of saying that like Laetitia is like associated with Pisces or whatever it is in your particular schema, but that the very forms of the figures, the ideas of what the figures represent are themselves astrological mechanisms, if you want to call it that. Yeah. And as much as it isn't about just the North Node, it is absolutely informed by that. It has its own meanings. And what I find fascinating is how much the North and the South nodes in geomantic practice, at least in Western geomantic practices I'm most familiar with, really do kind of square to kind of goodies and baddies, or goodie and a baddie, a white hat and a black hat, that Caput is about prosperity, and whether that's spiritual, material, or emotional, that it's about earthly goodness, gentle blessings, favorable beginnings, in some cases new leaves turned, but that it increases all the things of the house in which it is marked. So like increases life in the first, money in the second, siblings in the third, your father's old age in the fourth, kids in the fifth, etc. What's also interesting is that this increase can, even though it's like benevolent, can have negative consequences, right? So it increases sickness in the sixth, it increases adversaries in the seventh, increases death in the eighth, increases restrictions in the 12th. It's also bad for finishing things when you find it as a second witness, right? It's the butterfly mind that's really fascinated by beginning something else rather than finishing things. And it's ineluctably tied to Cauda in more ways than many other figures are to their opposites of, the hard work of Fortuna Major being its upside down is Fortuna Minor, a figure that is not of hard work, is about coasting and it will be all right on the night and quick fixes. Or even like Tristitia and Laetitia, which we talked about last time, in this cycling of sorrow and joy. But literally in many geomancies, in many of the handbooks of this oracle, it's contrasted with Cauda, where Caput will have like whole like delineations as normal, and very often they'll just say when they get to Cauda Draconis, the tale is just glossed as just the opposite of everything we just said about Caput. Like it doesn't even go through the houses. It often just says it's the opposite of that, right? And so I think about it as like, especially in terms of how it turns up, where its undiscerning benevolence can still be harmful in terms of that like lack of a fire line, or that like quote passive fire line of the two dots there, that it's undiscerning increase, it's undiscerning blessings. It's also, not the spark of spring itself that awakens the seedling, but it's the new sapling poking its head up that's evidence that that's happened. And it's also a sapling in terms of having to be treated gently. It's doing its best, but it's not big enough to fight for itself necessarily yet. So there's a couple themes there that I think are really interesting. And yeah, I definitely read the form of it as like a sapling, or like a crocus, like just poking its head up, as well as I really associate it with tree magic, especially like the boughs of the live Hydra powerhouses of the earth. And I think you can see in its form as like looking up at a tall tree from like right under its shade. So there's like you think about it as like the perspective of even a huge tree, like stood right next to it, the branches don't look as big because they're like, because what perspective is doing.
It's interesting as you're talking about I don't often associate geometric figures with cards. Tarot cards, actually, perhaps just because there's a lot of discussion of those things, but specifically in my head now, I'm thinking about Baraja Española. There's a card, the Knight of Cups, right? So the card is often shorthanded as the arrival of the devil, or the arrival and the devil, depending where you go, but it's good for good and bad for bad. So it has this mercurial nature to it.
Yeah.
But it is always considered instability incarnate. And so even though it multiplies things, but it's used heavily in literature because of that association. So like, sea de ello lo que quiera y va como el caballo de copas. Be it how it may, there it goes, like the Knight of Cups. It's just one of those things, like it's a phrasing. But then I was thinking about the cut in the nature of a man on a horse holding a cup. That is the symbolism of the card itself. And like, ahí va is written on the card of like, there it goes. Here it is. Something is new. Something is changing things. And it can, reversed, it can also be a rogue, a womanizer, deceit, fraud. But there's something to this where it's like, the devil is here. We know it's here. Might be doing something small, might be doing something big, but you have to keep your eyes open. In which case, it's much like the nodes themselves, right? And there's something to that. This one is interesting because, and we've talked about the parallels before, and as far as the parallels to Odu from Ifar, Logun, that Caput and Cauda Draconis are Ogundan Osa, and that the head of the dragon is related to this kind of Osa energy, which is it's violent, sudden change. Like things get flipped on their head because in this it has no head there. So that's an interesting side of it. This is like the violent female ancestry. This is the violent female spirits in this sign, and that similarly the reverse when you're dealing with Cauda and not Caput. This is Ogunda. This is war on the earth. This is constant destruction. But you can harness both of these things for advantage. It's a little bit easier to harness the Ogunda energy than it is perhaps the Osa. Because, as far as you can guide the machete, you can guide the plow. It can be a little bit harder to guide the tornado. So again, both destruction, sudden destruction, destruction that must by its nature keep going. A little bit of the you knew what I was when you picked me up type of myth. Like you can engage with these forces, but they will not be what you think. The arrival of the devil in that way.
Yeah. Yeah, an arrival. Yeah, that's definitely a big theme in Caput. The idea of not just like the inner threshold, but the lintel when coming in. That it's said that one of its ways its form is glossed from, I think, the medieval onwards, is steps leading up to an open door, as opposed to Cauda 1112 of steps leading away from a closed door. So it is, despite the way we might talk about figures entering or exiting, which is normally about, is it pointy end towards you on the table? Is it pointy end down as you write it? Meaning it's trying to root itself in some way. It's trying to stick around. Or is it exiting? It's trying to leave. It's pointy end away. Its arrow is leaving the bow. You have kind of the opposite with Caput. It's about trying to establish things, even like it's establishing things, but it's about entering. It's about beginning. as opposed to cauda, which is often about ending and about the wake that the tail of the dragon leaves, the ashes after the fire.
Yeah, fascinating. I guess because it's just so taboo to talk about some of these energies, it's or trepidatious, right? We know something is off, so it's particularly pleasurable for me to talk about Caput and Cauda Draconis, I guess. Anyway, which is interesting. I guess that can kind of overlap with notions of patronage,
Yeah.
because what are the figures if not patrons of certain energies?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and their correspondences is a good way to look at it, perhaps.
Right,
But
right. What is emblematic of something bigger? What is metonymic, right? When we say the
yes,
wheel, when we mean the whole car, or the crown, when we mean either the monarch or the institution of monarchy, or indeed the whole nation underneath it. Yeah.
yeah. And I like this, I mean, because metonymic is such a lovely word. I really enjoy this understanding of metaphor and metonym as basically, contagion and sympathy.
Yes.
That really what it is we're reclassifying a little golden bough. But the idea that one thing either stands in for the whole with metonym, or that metaphor that it is like something else because it has something in common.
It is something elsing, right? Like the difference
Yeah.
between the car shot like a rocket and the car rocketed, right?
Yeah.
It again means it's verbing again, right? As opposed to nouning. Yeah.
Which is bringing up, because we reference it a lot, and it's definitely it is a sweet spot of the performance theorists. But musicking, right, as a term, the idea that this is Christopher Small, I believe. I earned that master's. I'm going to figure it out. But the idea behind musicking, that there's this separation that is incredibly artificial to separate the listener of the music from the composer, from the player.
Yeah.
And all of them are musicking. Anybody most people, I would hope, in their life are familiar with the point where you have headphones on and you're totally involved at a concert or whatever it is. And it's not about the social nature or the substances, although those can be part of it. But there's a point where you are the music because you're listening to it in a certain way. And that this is no different than being a fire in the mind of the composer that's creating this music, or the person that's playing it for you to be able to hear it.
Yeah.
And that this idea of this verb, this how does something do something, that all musical activity from composing to performing to listening is musicking. That this can be, by extension, how is anything done? That notion that God is a verb type of thing that was a very popular subject and book for a while. That the idea behind performance theory is how does it become a verb of itself? Not just for the brand recognition of Googling, but rather how does ow is performance. You perform ow. It's not disingenuous, which, we'll get into without getting into it heavily, but performative isn't necessarily an insult. At least
no, it's an act, as in like an action, not as in a like you say, not as in a dissimulation.
Yeah, and a lot of it is subconscious. A lot of it is subtle. A lot of it is cultural. A lot of it is contextual. So what you can do as a person who is studying performance, whether you are an actor, musician, writer, because that's a form of performance, is that you can then consciously bring attention to it and see how to perform that thing better, or to analyze and be, a pedantic ass. But all those things are there. So I guess just in that way of how does one George in this sense, we've talked about so far that the idea of being so inextricably tied into protection and war and patronage, as the patron of patrons, as you said, like that's part of his Georgingness.
Yeah.
And I think that patron has a lot to do with that. And I like that link to it. That it is, how do patron saints evolve? There's this notion, and I knew we've talked about it before because I know we've talked about it, of, the idea of well, what's the patron saint of this thing? And it's well, your patron saint should be the one that you have a relationship with, because that's who your family or your clan or your town or whoever, in the same way that before, and I think as American Catholics have lost a lot of touch with this, because the difference of where does patron saint really start with? Well, adopting a patron saint goes back to when the building of the first churches in the Roman Empire were built over the graves of martyrs. So you were literally over the grave of a person who was performing miracles and tied to heaven in that way. So the patron saint was the patron of that church who you went to and performed miracles and helped with your prayers and intercessed on your behalf. And it started in this way that, yes, so that part of it is perhaps contagion based in that way, but there is also looking to their stories as to what they uniquely went through. Because when we go into the relic trade, which we've talked about as well in the past, of carrying a little piece of this saint over here to bring that saint cult, so that as if it is the tomb of that saint. so that the patron saint of St. Peter's Church would be St. Peter. The patron saint of St. Peter's Church would be St. Rita. There might be other relics there, but the idea that, like, can take Rita, for instance, is a patron saint of impossible things, for sure, but she's connected to bees because there's beehives at her abbey. She's connected to roses because she's depicted with a crown of roses, which oftentimes female mystics who experience stigmata, especially thorn or crown stigmata, were often given to roses in that way. She's a patron of abused women because she was married to a man who was terrible, and she, he dies and her sons are going to vow to retaliate, and she prays that she would rather see them dead than to commit the sin of murder. And so they die. And it's become this thing of like, you're dealing with a woman who, from her examples, shows you she knows what it's like to be married to in a rough situation and trying to do what's best for her family. So she becomes incredibly sympathetic towards people in similar circumstances. Is there an official patron saint list? No, that's not actually a thing. Right. But there are historical exemplars of patron saint lists, like talking about the 14 holy helpers who are invoked for health across the board. So if you go to Dymphna, she's beheaded. Of course she helps with headaches. Mm-hmm. If you go to breast cancer or anything concerning the breasts, Agatha had her breasts chopped off. She chopped them off herself. But, and so she becomes a patron of breasts. Lucy becomes a patron of eyesight things, which is all kind of joking in some weird way too, right? Of like, I know you went through this horrible thing in your lifetime, but that's what people are going to pray to you for. So,
right. Do you think Jesus wants to see a cross when he comes back?
Yeah, exactly. It's that. Why did they crucify Jesus instead of stoning? It's like so Catholics would cross themselves instead of hitting themselves on the head. But
yeah, I think this theme of like the idea of patronage being of like a particular being, like animals or a place, whether a type of terrain or a particular town or country, or a people, whether you're talking like inclusive tribe or exclusive, or association or guilds, or even particular like actual families, yes, or even particular endeavors like finding lost property. It comes either and both from thinking emblematically, the patron of an activity, a mythic activity, like, I don't know, dragon slaying, for instance, yeah, and or it comes from thinking locally, who is your local church's saint, your local river nymph, your local mountain goddess, your local thing in the woods. Right. And so I think this definitely brings up the ideas around like exploring patronage as a process of discovery and an engagement with mysteries, not classifying out topics into this like off the rack, who's the patron saint of getting a job, but integrating into your whole life. And that's where I think a lot of the tensions and the questions have come across in terms of finding a patron versus a patron finding you, of heeding a call. And pledging yourself to something versus like prescribing patron powers. Like, yeah, I think that's where it really gets sticky, but also interesting.
Yeah, I think that's really, it is parallel to something that we have talked about and something that I wish we could teach a class, and you could through exemplars, but it is not something you can impart in one class other than give notes on. But for instance, how to read a historical text, a grimoire that doesn't have complete like how-to spells,
right,
and pull practical work out of it.
Yeah.
And this is similar to what is happening with patronage, that someone may feel because of their exposure to a story and a family devotion. There are families that are so devoted to St. Barbara and St. Catherine that like it doesn't matter what other saints you need to pray to. That's who you have an altar to in your home.
Yeah.
And they're going to solve all of your problems. Yeah. There are other people who don't have that connection and are looking for a connection, which reminds me in part of kind of like, as I think we discussed before, but like the notion that Orisha, had descendants upon this earth, and that in an ideal world, you come from an Orisha worshiping family. So you know that father is from an Ogun family and that mother is from an Obatala family. Mm. And that their child is going to be one of those two Orishas most likely, but you can divine and see if maybe they're coming in bringing a new Orisha energy. Mm. And it didn't matter if you're from an Ogun town, everybody got initiated to Ogun. You might have other Orishas in your life, but Ogun is the primary because it's the primary Orisha of your town. Ogun lived there as a king in the the 1200s or something.
Yeah.
So like this idea that if you don't know, you have to rely on other practices. That like here we do head markings and investigations in the diasporic traditions to see which Orisha would be the best one for you to crown to. And we've lost that ancestral lineage in that way. And similarly, I think with patrons, with saints is like, but who's your saint? And the person might be like, oh, well, I'm confirmed under this name. Okay, like, do you have a shrine for Bernard of Clairvaux because your patron of your confirmation was Bernard. And you're like, oh, I have an image, but really my family really prays to, the Infant of Prague a lot. And you're like, okay, well, what is it you use it? And you'll find out that people are using the Infant of Prague for all sorts of things that aren't listed in the official quote unquote patron list that you can Google. Mm-hmm. But by the time you go to St. Francis of Assisi, he's going to be used for animals, but he could be used for like trying to understand deeper meanings of things because the dude put ashes on his food so he wouldn't enjoy them. It was a stigmatic. He understood death in a very different way. He understood how to sacrifice. He was hardcore. But like, is it just animals? No. And like, you could go to him for many things. That's the point of it, right? St. Matthew is accountants traditionally. St. Michael the Archangel is often soldiers, paratroopers, policemen, firefighters especially, but also grocers.
Yeah.
People who weigh things. Because he has a scale on his hands.
Yeah. And again, that's partly like these visual puns. That's partly, a little bit, can definitely be seen, like you said, as a kind of cruel joke, but it's also about like putting yourself in someone else's shoes, right? Of being like, as I am having this eye trouble, I feel I understand you better, Lucy, right? I feel I am approaching some of the horrors that you went through, and can you help me through those?
Yeah.
This sense again of the repertoire of practice as living and not archive of pigeonholed topics, of a coagula of things rather than a solve of them.
Yeah, that's really okay. So that's kind of like how that one verse is like, I have initiated to this mystery at the hands of elders, and now I will initiate myself to myself, which is, has that Odinic Havamal type things there. But the idea that no matter what information is given you, you must make it new for yourself. So again, and I'll phrase in the terms of archive and repertoire. Thank you, Dinah Taylor. But the idea that, that you can reference the archive by making it part of your repertoire, the thing that changes it, the umbanda terreiro that is invoking this saint to actually give practical advice, and therefore is not necessarily the same as the one across the street, nor does it need to be.
Right. The confraternity that's doing the saint, that's sainting, that's paying for those statues, that's tending to the candles for the dead, that's parading it around the streets, that's clacking the jaws of the dragon. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fun. I like that. On that note too, what's interesting, I guess, is just because I know we've talked a lot, and I don't want to skip over Franz Barton because I think he's worth talking about. But the fool is in this notion, right? A little bit of like abandonment to the thing, where the fool first perhaps seeks the patron lists of a saint to find out who will cure his headache, and the fool knows eventually that there's a mystery in the focusing on one saint for all things and fully communicating with them to the point where the saint becomes a familiar spirit, which is a very kind of larger magical approach, the bringing of the reenchantment of our relationship with things, that it is not just lists, that we are actually trying to make things personable, that we're not going off just symbolism, but that we are going off of an allegory in our lives, that we bring both metaphor and metonym in that way before we jump off the cliff in a leap of faith into our 21 new versions of ourselves that are called.
Yeah. And you see this with the makeover that the Trump of the fool gets, right? Where it starts as this like vagrant or outcast, or even like associations with literally the mentally ill. Some of the earliest depictions have them with this like kind of not a crown, but like feathers on the head, being feather-brained, being dressed in rags, that the large club seems to be initially about keeping the dogs that are attacking them at bay, and how similar this is to the vice of folly. So yeah, you see in the Visconti's Forza deck of the 1450s, it's made for like the Duke of Milan, right? It's very similar to a painting, a fresco by Giotti at one of the chapels in Padua, which pairs virtues and vices. And stultitia, stupidity or lack of reason, is paired with prudence, reasonableness, and forethought. It's this idea of like the fool that doesn't think before they act necessarily, and that this becomes the foolish one, or the one that's fallen on hard times, becomes very much this idea of we can look back on it again with Backtribution and say that like this is very much the zero of the zero to hero story that we'll get in the Fool's Journey, laid out much later formally under that name by Eden Gray in the 1960s, right? Where it's the interpretation of the fool as this cosmic life force descending into manifestation to experience all of these different turns of the cards in this very like cosmic consciousness playing itself out. But like, so yeah, you get the wandering vagrant going from thing to thing, madness, delusion, confusion. And then the Marseille starts to bring in like jester elements. So there's still a wandering one. And in some of the early ones, they've still literally got their arse hanging out, right? Or that they don't realize that they're flashing people, but is perhaps also a roving entertainer more than a straight up vagrant. And this question of like, are they free on the road, or are they subject to its windings? Are they self-reliant, or are they like reliant on the kindness of strangers, as Blanche will say, right? And even up to like French occultists like Papus, as well as Oswald Wirth, you get like the fool representing this disordered state of the mind. And there's almost this like moral judgment there of like what happens when you can't resist temptation or irrational impulses. Still kind of like the disadvantaged like self-victimhood of your moral failings. And then Then with the Golden Dawn, like all sorts of things change. This assigning of the Fool to the Zero more formally, and to particularly to Aleph. And so now it's about the breath of life and beginnings and initiation and innocence. And then and then we get, like you say, the leap of faith with like Waite in Pictorial Key talking about now in not a rags, their own young man in gorgeous vestments, right? The rags have become resplendent, right? The edge which opens up on the depths has no terror, says Waite. He is pure spirit in search of experience. And so we go from this notion of like the 15th century fool as pre-rational or the victim of, disordered thinking, or indeed, a disordered society that doesn't recognize that, to a modern fool that kind of transcends the limits of logic and rational analysis. And so the fool kind of, like at odds with conventional society, dancing, as I was reading, dancing to music only he can hear, right? So musicking once again. Yeah, sorry, I was at ramble as I was thinking about this.
No, that's great.
That's through notes and things. A foolish journey.
Right? Like that's otherwise it's like what's boring for us. We're not here to just like quote other things. At least I'm not. I don't know.
But yeah, the idea of like finding the freedom in the road, that the edge of the cliff doesn't have to be a scary thing, without assuming that angels are going to hold you up. Wile E. Coyote falls when he looks down, right? In the cartoon physics of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes you have to fall to fly.
Yeah. And yeah, again, that like what can seem restrictive can be something that allows us to return to the depths of it and engage with the mysteries of it, not from an expectation or like, I've worked this grimoire for 40 years. Of course I know it the best, right? But of like, and hopefully it's, I keep finding new avenues to pursue. Mystery as a renewable resource, not as a boundary of dogma that may not be crossed or questioned.
Yeah.
Again, heresy, not blasphemy.
Always. Yeah. That is my life's work right there. Well, because you want to make it useful. That's what we're doing, right? It's like, how do you make these various topics, find the connections between them is what makes it interesting.
Yeah.
Otherwise it's a book report. And we know how I feel about new natives as far as like, I don't, and what I mean by that, for as the aside, I suppose I should footnote myself, is like, we can see the trend oftentimes that when something is first talked about in a new language, that it becomes this kind of anthropological high, the dopamine fix of like new information, new culture, new things for me to take from or to be in wonder at, or things like that, the in vogue trend. And I think that is illusory and usually a disservice to the culture or traditions that are being talked about. And although we need that introductory information, it is far more interesting to see what connections are being made, what is actually the work being done by people, as opposed to dangling the carrot of new information constantly, because where does it get us? And that's its own connection to the fool, I suppose. And probably in some ways a good kind of segue into Barden, right? Because there's at least in the 90s, early 2000s, when people would say like, what was the magician that you really found a lot of inspiration with? Like Franz Barden was really held up there, but you had to be able to read like and not get bored. Because he had specific ideas that were espoused that I don't think we found in the exact same thing. Specifically, like fluid condensers were such a huge thing within the chaos groups. But the idea that you can combine certain elemental descriptions or planetary descriptions, and that it created something that attracted that similar energy. Yeah. And Barden is coming out. So first off, Barden is 1909 to 1958, Czech occultist and student, and is a hermeticist. That's how he classifies himself. So whether or not he's always going to be called that, that's up to him and the Hermeticist purists.
Right.
He is known for at least 3 volumes on Hermetic magic. And then there's this kind of pseudo thing called Frabado the Magician, which is a biographical sketch written by his, I believe, secretary. But because he probably was so involved in citing everything, they give it to him, which is kind of like, are you just erasing the woman, or are we just pretending she didn't exist? Or anyway.
Right. Along with the kind of semi-mythologization of the teacher, there's also, exactly, this like marginalizing of the secretary.
So he writes Initiation into Hermetics, Practical Magic Evocation, and the Key to the True Kabbalah. Notions on Kabbalah aside, about how Lurianic Western occultic Kabbalah is rarely actually, related to many other expressions of Kabbalah within a Jewish, Muslim, or otherwise context where Kabbalah exists as its own traditions. We're talking about Hermetic Kabbalah here, and he's held up as an in-depth thinker and someone who was actually trying to get practical results. There is a definite spiritualist, theosophist remnant in his works, as far as the conflation, which I think is in Frabado mainly, but that he was, a holy man named Mahatma or Mahum Tata or Hakuminatata. But this Potobova, the secretary, it just writes that, he's basically in this like great elite, the White Lodge idea, right? That there's these people who are promoting higher knowledge from afar, which is we see heavily promulgated in the Theosophist extent going forward in that way. There's a lot of Freemasonic ideas that are espoused in Frabado the Magician specifically, that, that Hermes Trismegistus was the esoteric creator of Hermeticism and the founder of Freemasonry, who paid the karma that generated when he lived as Hermes Trismegistus into Freemasonry. Like it's a very strange thing. It doesn't quite correspond to Barton's ideas, but I don't know. There's a lot of stuff there. As far as the other books, it's actually walking you through mental exercises, astral exercises, physical exercises, stressing the idea of physical health and integration of the physical body, which has some notions of, yes, the kind of yogic practices and things that you see in Crowley, but almost more of the Gurdjieffian thing of like, you must make sure the body is healthy in order to actually be using the mind the way that you want to.
Yeah.
So this idea of the balance of these three bodies, which is in this case specifically astral, emotional, and physical in this way, which kind of corresponds to the three centers of Gurdjieff, and move on through those things, but are not directly correlated, or not directly the same. So I think there's, his training system is pretty strong, but there's 10 practical steps in his first book, and then it moves through that to the practice of magical evocation, which goes into the planets and stars and moons and the earth itself, and is building upon the greater medieval Renaissance Reformation magic that's out there. But he also has a collection of sigils in there, which are, if I remember correctly, like they're unknown into the origin of, that they're unique. And so he's dealing with the evocation of spirits, which that makes me, of course, be like, then that might be that he actually was talking to spirits, and this is how they agreed to be called.
Right.
And that he does go into the kind of mesmerism of altered states of consciousness and quote unquote natural meditation, which is really kind of an ecstatic trance, and then projecting your consciousness into the sphere of the entity and then calling your consciousness back. So there's kind of this interesting thing that would be later kind of akin to like tantric visualization.
Yeah.
But he's using it in this way, similar, but again, not identical. And that, he emphasizes very strongly, you have to have done the hard work before you go into the secondary, like the fun work. You have
He says a lot of the time, right, that like you have to go through all 10 steps, and even like a lot of his students and people that teach his work now emphasize that like most people will pick it up, try a couple things, and get bored and not finish it. And they emphasize that Barden himself says a lot, like, you really can't get much out of this. Not only can you not get much out of this that's like positive or like useful magical results until you've like worked the whole system, but like it even seems Barden at various points says it's dangerous to try to run before you can walk.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's so many kind of spiritualist nods, but he's still a hardcore hermeticist. And like the idea of divine authority becomes so strong, of like reliance upon a hierarchy of the universe as to why you have the authority to call your spirit back or another spirit back. That it's
because otherwise spirits are going to turn up and mislead you. They're going to manipulate you. They're going to like move the planchette around and spell out nonsense on the Ouija board.
Exactly. So it's both the engagement in the spiritualist narrative, but an admonition for the casualness of the spirit, of the common practice of spiritualism. Yeah. So it's everybody has a right to explore these things. Everybody has an ability to develop these gifts. However, there is still a hierarchy in the universe. Not all people have the same gifts, and that there's no substitute for hard work as your foundation of your practices. So it kind of plays into the traditionalist camps, or even the perennialists later on.
Yeah,
there's a little bit of like, is this Guénon in a different form for some people? And there is a complexity behind the politics that we don't. That's not what I know of him. So it's just, I find it here's what you need to do. This next book is the 202. And then we move on to the key of the true Kabbalah, right? That is trying to, if you read that first, which a lot of people really like his references in there, if you don't have the foundation, if you don't go through all the exercises, I'm not saying I have, the idea is that you don't quite necessarily understand what is being said as much. Yeah. And the highest levels of your magical goal, your highest magical goal or magical attainment, there we go, is through understanding the sensorium, the sound, number, vibration, color, as embodied in Hermetic Kabbalah, which is not my viewpoint, but is still like, there's something about a man who's like, I got 3 books for you, and here they are. Complete system. Go.
Laying it out. Right. Yeah. And with all of that, like, I'm really reflecting on this as you're talking about it, like with all of that sense of like, you gotta get your astral gains in, bro. You know, you gotta lift, you gotta boss spirits around, you gotta acknowledge that there's hierarchy and everything. There's also like this real sense of like the engagement with this stuff shouldn't just be, again, like I rant about, certainly shouldn't just be abstract correspondences that make you think you know something because you've put it in a pigeonhole, but like the lived embodied experience of color, of tastes, of physical environment through his, primarily, like the way I came to Bard and stuff was through pore breathing and through, I think it was actually reading Jason Miller's stuff on recommending pore breathing. And I especially really enjoyed his stuff about like breathing in with the whole body, like beauty and harmony in front of paintings. That definitely helped me get a lot more out of abstract art. Along with like, you know, my monkey mind trying to be like, what was the history of this? What was the artist doing? Like, blah, 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 like, what are the dates on this? Like actually experiencing it, but also to kind of counter that sense of like, it's just about bragging about the work. No, it's about doing the work. Is that like pore breathing looks like humoral energetics to me, right? The goal of it and achieving that equilibrium being about balancing out the four gross elements and the behavioral tendencies which they produce, crucially, right? In order to like not control the universe and all the spirits underneath me with the crown of creation, but of having a sense of responsibility of our own engagements and reactions, and of how we respond to things and how we can draw strength from things and explore the sympathies and antipathies of things.
Yeah, there's something in that trailing of how things go, because there's certainly concepts that he seems to, if not have originated, just kind of brought to the public, and the way he phrased things and the links between things, that's why he's cherished as an author.
Yeah, he's pretty modern, right? Like, he's certainly, again, in reading blogs of like his people that have taken up his teachings, they talk about, you know, like you said, altered states of consciousness, the emphasis on like symbolic or meanings of traditional ritual tools and temple designs, right?
Yeah, he's, because it's interesting because the Golden Dawn, without any value judgment on it, is still a reaching back to this, you know, Egypt before creation but perfected type of thing. And he's not doing that. He's honoring the origin of these stories, but even in like Frabato, where like Hermes Trismegistus, a former life of his perhaps, is working off negative karma as Franz Bardon type of thing. The idea that, you know, ego aside, there's an allowance for Hermeticism to be more than a bourgeois fantasy, that it can be a thinking man's, modern man's, scientific man's, every man's, and all gender expressions in between, that there's a way for this to be within the modern world. And I think that is an interesting side of it. I think it lays down for like, because there was a lot of SoCal OTO members that first recommended Franz Bardon to me, and Chaos. And that was just kind of the thing of like, how do you do this practically? How do you engage with this material in a way that is not just trying to be nostalgic, not just escapist, but have practical results in your lives?
Again, not just trying to appeal to the archive of all of this potential occultism, but of like, of trying to see anew and fold into an actual life and living.
Yeah. And ultimately, I think there's a misnomer, because there's this thing where people quote him as saying like, oh, for those that don't have a teacher, read these books. No, he is becoming the teacher. That was the goal. Like, the book was a channel, was a go-between for people that could not find a teacher in the waking or within, you know, a common physical universe, that this system as he outlined it was complete and would allow you to then explore past that. Again, everything's bound by certain contextualized cultural expectations and things like that, and a preference and predilection towards a certain type of ceremonial magic. But I think he accomplishes what he set out to do in that way, that like there are many people that swear by it. Like, this is what I get results from. But poor man dies of pancreatitis while in the custody of police. So life is hard sometimes, but I don't think he's as rarely known as he once was. But I still think it's a good person to bring into the Dead Magicians Take a Shot category in this way.
For sure.
I think we've covered everything.
I think so. Yeah. Weaving these saffron veins through things.
Like a piece of jasper. Crawling on our knees to the baby Jesus, because we're the youngest and our knees are the strongest. And carrying Winston Churchill's plane and throwing it at dragons like it's made of paper. And well, it's been a lovely conversation, and thank you so much, Aloysius, as always, and thank you, dear listener, for your continued something
interest, support, hopefully
It's
enthusiasm.
support.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes, enthusiasm. Hopefully there's some brainworms in there. But please find us through the usual channels of our radiofreegolgotha.com, where we will continue to update talks and appearances and things like this. I know there's a few more coming for both of us in the year. Continue, please. Our individual websites are linked on our page there as well. We do have the Folk Necromancy group on Facebook, which is a large number of people that some of them realize they're there for Radio Free Golgotha and the others will learn. But
and if you are going to join, please, says a beleaguered mod, please just fill out. There are two questions. One is like, are you okay with people having different points of view? And the other is like, hey, what are you interested in? We're not judging anyone, but please answer them.
Please answer them. Or, be poetic. And we've gotten some really amazing answers that we've had all moderators said, absolutely not. This person should not be allowed. But we are not in the business of rejecting outright. So yeah, please engage, disengage, have fun, argue, send love letters, death threats, and proposals to someone else. But thank you. Wishing you a very happy or forceful or spring-filled St. George's Day.
Yeah.
And may all your demons, known and unknown, help usher in new, wonderful insights into all that you're doing.
Wonderful. Exactly. Yeah. Thank you, Jesse. Thank you, everyone. Yeah. Have a great St. George's and ready to spring forward into the May.
Bye!